Welcome to Airchecks. Last week and this week, we will be playing all of the episodes of Ripley's Believe It or Not. Tales of the absurd and bizarre made their way to the airwaves through this strange and eccentric old-time radio series. Ripley's Believe It or Not starred none other than Robert Ripley himself as he shared his out-of-this-world discoveries and experiences while traveling around the globe. His standard practice was to take note of the unusual sights and practices he came across during his travels and chronicled them in his journal. It was not until 1930 that the program was made available to a public audience. Whereas other old radio shows focused on a particular story of a character or theme, Ripley's Believe It or Not took a more informative slant with each episode and shared odd bits of trivia and weird facts with its listeners. Throughout the years, the program constantly evolved and changed format several times to meet the public's demands. However, like all things, the show ran its course and officially ended in 1948 after an 8-year run. Here is the final part of Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Don Pedro II, Emperor of Brazil, sold titles of nobility at $10,000 each. With the money he raised, he built an insane asylum. He put this sign in front: the vain to the foolish. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the shell that had a man's number. George Macmillan, a member of the Royal Canadian Air Force, was in a dugout in France when a piece of jagged shell casing the size of a silver dollar landed beside him with a sinister whine. He noticed that it bore a number, 26750. With nervous fingers, he took out his Air Force identity card. His service number was exactly the same. The shell had his number on it, and he lived to tell the tale. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The fastest living thing is the frigate bird. Commander J.E. Capstickdale clocked its flight by means of a ship's chronometer in 1941 and found that it moved at a speed of 261 miles per hour. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man whose socks got him out of jail. Fred Treadwell was in the Lyon County Jail at Emporia, Kansas in 1899, charged with burglary. For 2 months, he plotted a break. He wore homemade woolen socks, which he raveled into yarn. He covered the yarn with soap and rolled it in sand and cement particles. The sanded yarn acted as a rasp. Nightly, he drew the strands across his cell bars over and over until the bars were severed. Although his escape was ingenious, he was recaptured and returned to jail. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
On November 25th, 1911, 3 men were hanged on Greenberry Hill in London, England for murder. The names of the 3 men in the order of their execution were Green, Berry, and Hill. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the greatest fish tale of them all. The clipper ship Crusader, an immigrant ship en route from England to New Zealand with 214 passengers aboard, was only 5 days out in the Bay of Biscay when it sprang a leak. The water was coming in faster than the crew could pump it out. As they were about to abandon ship, the water mysteriously stopped pouring in, and they made port. There it was discovered they'd been saved by a gigantic fish. The inrush of water had tightly wedged it into the hole. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Zachary Taylor was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, when the letter notifying him of his nomination for the presidency arrived. The letter bore no postage and was marked collect, so he refused it. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a president who slept through his entire term of office. Zachary Taylor refused to be sworn in as President of the United States on a Sunday. So David Rice Atchison, who was President pro tem of the Senate, was President of the United States from noon on March 4th until noon on March 5th, 1849, when Taylor at last took the oath of office. Unaware of the great honor which had been thrust upon him, Atchison spent the 24 hours of his presidency in bed. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
One day, Nimrod Robertson of the Yukon Territory shot a bear. As he had lost all of his own teeth, he fashioned a plate out of the bear's teeth. He then proceeded to eat the bear with its own teeth. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the costliest bombardment of all time. The Mohammedan conqueror Alauddin Khilji invaded India and laid siege to Delhi in 1296. After the aggressor ran out of stone cannonballs for the catapults, he opened his treasury and ordered the engines loaded with bags of solid gold. After several hundred rounds, the bewildered garrison surrendered the fortress. A single round weighed about 100 pounds, so this golden ammunition cost the victor about $15 million. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
In Berlin, Germany, a thief who had just robbed a meat store attempted to escape by jumping through a skylight. He was hanged by an armful of sausages which he had stolen. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the weird story about an accident that was reported before it happened. The police in Richmond, California, received an urgent phone call asking them to hurry to San Pablo and McDonald Avenues, as the train had just hit a truck, hurting a man badly. Upon arriving with an ambulance, they found no accident. In fact, the train hadn't even arrived. They were about to leave in disgust when the train roared in, colliding with a truck driven by Randolph Bruce. He suffered a brain injury and a crushed chest. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
In 1800, when our presidential election was thrown into the House of Representatives, William Claiborne cast his vote for Thomas Jefferson, electing him president over Aaron Burr by just one vote. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how important one vote can be. In 1649, King Charles I of England appeared before a tribunal of 135 judges. It was up to them to decide his fate. They were charged with the responsibility as to whether he would live or die. 67 of the judges voted that his life be spared. 68 of them voted for his execution. Thus, King Charles I of England was sentenced to death by a majority of one single vote. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Corporal Joe Aiello of Bronx, New York, was forced to bail out over Morotai Island in the Philippines. His ripcord failed, and he fell more than a half mile, landing in a tree. He lived to return his parachute unopened. Believe it or not. In a moment, the real Cinderella story. The original Cinderella was really a young Egyptian woman of great beauty. Her real name was Rhodopis. In the original story, the famous slipper was made of fur, not glass. It seems the translator mistook the French word V-A-I-R-E, which means fur, for V-E-R-R-E, which means glass. Since then, Cinderella and her glass slipper have been inseparable. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
In the Johanneum Museum in Dresden, Germany, there is a vase which was bought by August the Strong of Saxony from Frederick William I of Prussia. The price paid for it was 400 human beings. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man who paid our national debt. James Swan came to America as a youth from Fifeshire, Scotland. He settled in Boston, where he prospered. In 1787, he moved to France, where he continued to acquire wealth. At that time, the United States owed France the money advanced our struggling nation during the Revolution. Swan decided to pay it out of his own pocket. On July 9th, 1795, he paid $2,024,899.93. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Adrienne Keogh was the most fickle woman in the world. She was engaged 652 times, married 53 times, and for 23 years, she changed her mind on an average of once every 12 days. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a discovery made on a camel. Veterinarians who've spent a lifetime observing camels still confess that they know less than nothing about them. However, one thing we do know is that the camel was responsible for the discovery of butter. Some unknown Bedouin in a remote period loaded a skinful of milk to take with him on a journey. The peculiar ambling gait of the camel churned it to butter, and humanity was enriched by a new addition to its diet. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Newly hatched silkworms are so tiny that 700,000 of them weigh only 1 pound. Within 6 weeks, their total weight will increase to 9,500 pounds, a gain of 950,000%. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about one of the strangest court trials in history. In 1540, a clothes moth was brought to trial before Judge Corrector Portoliero in Spain. The moth was charged with having destroyed a tapestry of a priceless and luxurious weave. After a formal trial, the moth was found guilty and sentenced to have its throat cut. Now, no matter what you think of this trial, the moth was innocent. Moths don't eat cloth or tapestries. The true culprits are the larvae of the moth. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
If you happen to accidentally break a piece of your best crystal, perhaps this will give you some consolation. In the time of Nero, to replace an ordinary water glass would have cost you $6,000. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a lighthouse built on cotton. In 1761, an American ship laden with cotton from India was driven ashore in a storm and wrecked near Lesso, England. The salvaged bales were piled on the shore. The combination of cotton, seawater, and sand turned the bales into a mass as solid as granite. Lesso Lighthouse was built upon this cotton foundation, a sandy shore where before no structure of any kind could be built. The cotton foundation has endured for over 190 years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The moon exerts a greater gravity pull upon a ship than it does upon the water, thus reducing a ship's displacement. Therefore, every ship weighs more in the daytime than it does at night in the moonlight. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the unusual story of a mystery ship. If you have a tendency to be superstitious, consider the strange fate of the Thomas W. Lawson, the only 7-masted schooner ever built. The Lawson was named after the author of a book entitled Friday the 13th. One day in 1907, the Lawson put to sea and was shipwrecked. She sank with a loss of 16 lives. And what was the day on which the Lawson went to the bottom of the sea? On Friday, the 13th of December. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
We think of the wooden barrel as a rather prosaic object in our lives. However, when the Chinese finally became acquainted with the wonders of the West, The simple barrel impressed them as a technical miracle. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a priceless barrel. When Raphael, the great painter, saw a mother crooning to her infant while an older boy stood beside her, the sight so inspired him he decided to paint it. Today, it ranks with the greatest masterpieces ever produced. It's known as Madonna della Sedia. Raphael gave it away in payment for a 25-cent meal. As Raphael did not have a canvas or an easel at the time, he painted it on the round top of a wine cask, a simple barrel. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Did you know that if you tried to arrange 15 books in all possible ways, and if you made a change a minute, it would take you 2,487,996 years to do it? Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how a man's intuition saved his brother's life. Francois de Seville was declared dead in the year 1562, and he was buried. However, his brother had a strange intuition about it. As a result, 6 hours later, he had Francois disinterred, and sure enough, he was revived. Francois lived to enjoy 70 more years of life. In fact, he died at the ripe old age of 105 from a cold he contracted while serenading the lady of his heart all night long. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The Roman Emperor Vitellius was the greatest glutton in all history. He spent more than $375,000 a day on food alone, yet he starved his own mother to death. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you where the word restaurant came from. Until 1776, eating places were always part of a hotel or inn. Then a chef named Boulanger opened the first public dining place in Paris. He placed a sign in front of his establishment with an adaptation from the famous quotation from St. Matthew, "Come unto me, all ye that are hungry, and I shall restore you." From that word restore, restaurare in French, his place became known as Restaurant. This name has since been applied the world over. Believe it or not.
Is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
If you think your wife is costing you too much money, consider the Sabeu women of Manipur, India. They must be bought and paid for anew each year. This makes them the most costly wives in the world. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the strange fate of a hanging judge. Benedict Karpzau was president of the Court of Sessions in Leipzig, Germany from 1620 to 1666. During his long term on the bench, he passed more than 30,000 death sentences, principally for theft and witchcraft. About 20,000 were against women convicted of sorcery. This barbaric judge, who considered 5 death sentences just a day's work, died of a broken heart a few minutes after the death of his pet dog. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Paul Hubert of Bordeaux, France, was convicted of first-degree murder. After he'd served 21 years in solitary confinement, he was acquitted. It was discovered that his supposed victim was none other than himself. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a very expensive cab ride. William Lord Draggs hailed a cab in Brighton, England one day and asked to be driven to West Pier. Upon arriving, he asked Martin Holloway, the cabbie, to wait while he took a sail on his new yacht. 599 days later, Draggs returned and found Holloway waiting. The Lord's bill came to £989, 15 shillings and 6 pence. He paid a cab fare of nearly $5,000. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Here's a real paradox for your collection. The flower known as Sweet William was named after William, Duke of Cumberland, who was better known as the Butcher for his cruelty to the Scots. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a remarkable feat in lifting. On September 25th, 1944, an incredible feat of lifting was witnessed by 200 people in Winner, South Dakota. Gardner A. Taylor, a 64-year-old blacksmith, lifted 175 pounds, an anvil weighing 155 pounds with a 20-pound weight on top of it. And the thing which makes this lifting feat so incredible is that Taylor lifted the entire 175 pounds with his ears. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The next time you're teeing up, remember the core of a golf ball contains germs. As they multiply, they develop pressure, which renders the ball more resilient. So, germs make better golf balls. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man in the golden mask. As the result of an injury, Farid ed-Din, Grand Vizier of Bokhara, Asia, wore a mask of solid gold. The sight of his face became so repulsive to him that he donned the mask at the age of 17. He wore it constantly, never removing it, for 84 years. During that time, no one ever saw his face, neither his king nor himself. He even directed that he be buried wearing the mask, and his last wish was respected. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
America is truly the land of opportunity. According to official U.S. statistics, there are 23,559 different ways of making a living in the United States. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about one of the most spectacular walks in history. In the dead of winter in 1898, a whaling fleet got caught in an ice jam in the Arctic Ocean. If the men were to survive, they needed help from the outside. So to save his shipmates from their icy tomb, George Tilton of Bedford, Massachusetts, volunteered to walk from Point Barrow to Kodiak Island to get help. He walked 1,200 miles through darkness, blizzards, and ice. His walk took him a total of 146 days. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
We've all heard the expression, it's raining cats and dogs. But imagine the surprise experienced by the people living in Essen, Germany, when in 1896, a large hailstone fell with a carp inside. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the costliest minute in history. The Roman Emperor Vitellius bought 1 minute of time for $250 million from Flamen, the chief priest of the province of Gaul. It was the chief priest's duty to determine the beginning and end of spring. For this $250 million, the Flamen agreed to extend the spring of the year 68 by 1 minute. Thus, Vitellius could boast that he had purchased the most unpurchasable of all commodities, time. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Here's a word for you folks who enjoy a martini. Wacholder Beerenbrand van Heinenschwanz. This formidable verbal giant of 38 letters is simply the German way of saying a gin cocktail. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you a fantastic story of motherhood. A new chapter in medical history will have to be written to account for the case of Mrs. Philippa Grijalba. She married 32-year-old Fruto Aldana of Tuño, Colombia, when she was 100 years old. A year later, she was delivered of a healthy baby boy, making him 101 years younger than his mother. This statement is based on official records of the municipality of Tuña and was published in El Heraldo of Bogota on February 26, 1945. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Annette Frelon, a 12-year-old girl of Abbeville of France, was able to reply to any question put to her by having the answer appear in bold red letters upon the skin of her arms, legs, and shoulders. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the marriage of the unconscious brides. One of the strangest marriage customs is in vogue among the Bugis of Celebes, Indonesia. The bride may not raise her eyes nor look upon a man until after her marriage is over. She's also forbidden to set foot upon the ground during the entire 3 days of her wedding. To ensure this, the bride is drugged until unconscious and then carried about on the shoulders of the head of her family. When she recovers consciousness, she's a married woman. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
To distinguish his son from all the other Smiths, a father in Homerville, Georgia, decided to give his boy a fraction for a Christian name, so he christened him 5/8 Smith. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about history's costliest bald-headed joke. 9-year-old Francis Selden of Ireland was heir to one of the largest fortunes in Europe. He was a student at Clermont College in Paris when King Louis XIV honored the school with a visit. The authorities decided to rename the College of King Louis the Great. Since the king was bald and Clermont is French for bare top, Selden quipped that the current name was quite appropriate. Upon hearing this, the king imprisoned him for 69 years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Soap was accidentally discovered by the ancients when the grease from the animals on their sacrificial altars dripped through and mixed with the wood ashes of the altar logs. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the greatest soldier of fortune of them all. Charles James Patrick Mahon was the last of the fabulous Irish gentleman adventurers. He served 6 terms in the British Parliament, fought 13 duels, and accumulated more active army ranks than any other mortal. He was a colonel in the Irish militia and in the armies of Turkey, Russia, Austria, France, Brazil, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Peru, and the United States. Also a general in Uruguay and a Chilean admiral. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
You could bet that the crab caught by George H. Goodbrod of Huntington, Long Island, left him more than a little amazed. It was wearing his wife's wedding ring, which she had lost the previous year. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a gesture that meant death. A popular belief is that a thumbs-down gesture condemned the ancient Roman. This is not true. Neither was thumbs up a sign of favor. When a gladiator was defeated, it was up to the spectators whether he should live or die. If the crowd wanted him to live, they shut their thumbs up within their fists so that they were not visible. If they wanted him to die, they turned out their thumbs. If the thumbs were visible, the gladiator was put to death. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Ball players make spectacular catches to win ball games. However, one of the most important catches was made by Frank Bruckman, a Brooklyn mail carrier. He caught a child in his mail pouch as it fell from a window. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a king with a strange appetite. The things people eat are sometimes a little startling. King Menelik of Ethiopia was a literal believer in the curative property of the printed page. Whenever he was sick or his heart was heavy, he always ate a page or two of the Bible. Eventually, either the king overestimated his capacity for reading matter, or he miscalculated the length of the book he ate. He died, as a result of eating the heavy Egyptian edition of the Book of Kings. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
If your old jalopy burns a lot of oil, just be thankful you don't have to replace it with watch oil. It's the most expensive petroleum product. Watch oil costs $800 a gallon. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a duel that lasted 19 years. Two officers in Napoleon's army, Major Pierre Dupont and Captain Fournier Solovis, first clashed in December 1794. The major's lady made a sarcastic comment about the captain. It resulted in a duel, but they were so evenly matched it was a draw. As a result, they fought the same duel a total of 2,100 times. The last duel in 1813 also was a draw, and they ended their quarrel after 19 years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
In 309 BC, Aristos, in charge of a flute orchestra in the Temple of Jupiter in Greece, called out his men because they were barred from eating lunch in the temple, making musicians the first strikers. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the secret of the sealed book. A sealed book of 100 pages titled The Onliest and Deepest Secrets of the Medical Art was found among the effects of the celebrated Dutch physician Dr. Herman Beerhoff after his death in 1738. The book was sold at auction for $10,000 in gold. The buyer discovered that 99 pages were blank. Only the title page bore this inscription: "Keep your head cool, your feet warm, and you'll make the best doctor poor. Believe it or not."
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
General Sir Arthur Sloggett was shot through the heart in the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. To the amazement of his physicians, he survived for another 31 years, dying at the age of 72. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a poet who received over $1 million a line. Philippe Deporte, French court poet, wrote a 3-line poem for King Henri III of France, who wanted to read it to his sweetheart. The poem read, "I would rather that heaven let me be born without a name and without honor, provided I could always be with you." The king granted the poet the revenue of 4 abbeys for life. In this way, he drew a total of $3,300,000, the largest fee in all history. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Count Octavio Morel of Rome, Italy, never used a comb or brush on his hair. He relied solely on rudimentary muscles in his scalp. He could comb and part his hair by willpower alone. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about one of the strangest religious celebrations in the world. Once a year, in the morning of the 12th day of the 3rd month, which is regarded as the Prophet's birthday, the Grand Sharif of Cairo rides to the Sadia Mosque, his principal house of prayer. In his path, the parishioners lie on the ground in the closest formation, with legs extended and arms clasped beneath their foreheads. His horse walks over the prostrate bodies. However, it's very rare for anyone of his living carpet to be hurt. Believe it or not.
Truth is fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Professor Rasmus Christian Rask of the University of Copenhagen was a linguist of such power and scope that he outdid the Mesofonte. He could speak 230 languages. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a book treated like a most revered book is the Granth Sahib, literally Mr. Book. It's the holy book of the Sikhs, the religious sect of India. Servants fan the book all day with golden-handled fans of peacock feathers. An orchestra plays sweet music before it, and sweets are offered to it continuously. The Golden Temple of Amritsar was built at a cost of $40 million for the express purpose of housing it. The costliest book cover in the world, believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the truth. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
To the Kwakyatul Indian of British Columbia, his name is his fortune. If he needs money, he simply pawns his name. However, until the loan is repaid, the borrower is nameless. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about nature's most remarkable memorial. In the year 660, the Kingdom of Korea was invaded by the Chinese. The Korean King Pakje, his sons and ministers, were made prisoners and transported to China. But the royal wives and concubines, 71 of them, committed suicide by hurling themselves into the river Kium from Nakwam Rock. Now, each spring, 71 flowers, and only 71, grow on the rock. Then they fall into the river on the same day each year. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the truth. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
Stephen Southwold, an English author, predicted the date of the outbreak of World War II. In Valiant Clay, a book published in 1931, he predicted Sunday, September 3rd, 1939. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the strangest nuptials of all time. The Tsarina, Anna Ivanovna, a cruel woman, became enraged with Mikhail Golitsyn. She ordered him to marry the ugliest woman in Russia, with all the dwarfs, freaks, and buffoons of the empire in attendance. The bridal couple were sealed in a bedroom of ice, with sheets and blankets of ice. The temperature was at 40 below zero, yet the couple survived and later twins were born to them. The Empress died at the time of the twins' birth. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the truth. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
Radford Williams, an Englishman, was convicted of murder and sentenced to be hanged. As a last request, he asked if he might be permitted to spring the death trap himself. He was, and he did. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man who stubbed his toe on $10 billion. George Walker, who worked on a farm not far from where Johannesburg stands today, was on his way to church one Sunday morning in March 1886 when he stumbled over a piece of protruding rock covered by grass. He knelt down to remove the cause of trouble and discovered the main reef conglomerate containing $10 billion worth of gold. Although he stumbled over the richest gold field in the world, Walker died in poverty. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the truth. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
Here's a good example of how real estate prices are going up. The Feathers Hotel in Ludlow, England, sold recently for $120,000. It was built in 1603 for a mere $110. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how California got its name. California was named after a mythical island in a romantic novel published in Spain in 1500. The novel is entitled The Exploits of Esplandius. The book came into the possession of a young law clerk in Sevilla, Spain. Years later, while searching for this mysterious island named in the book, he found it in what is today California. He named it in memory of the romantic novel. The young man was Hernando Cortez. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the truth. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
It's interesting to note the documents which will hold up in court. For example, a will scratched with a pocket knife on an auto fender was probated by the Surrogates Court in Saskatchewan, Canada in 1948. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how cheese won a naval battle. In a naval battle between the Argentine and Uruguayan fleets in August 1841, the Uruguayan fleet, commanded by Captain John Coe of the United States, ran out of cannonballs. Coe ordered a nearby pile of round, grimy-looking objects loaded into the guns. After 2 salvos at short range, the Argentine fleet sailed out of range. Thus, the battle was won by round, grimy Dutch cheeses so hard they weren't fit to eat, believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
The tomb of Ezra, most celebrated figure of the Old Testament next to Moses, has been used as a maternity hospital for 2,200 years. A priest and 22 midwives are in constant attendance, believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of the Golden Mummy. Shu Qi came to the throne of China at the age of 6 in 1644. After ruling 17 years, he fell in love with a concubine named Tung Qi. Because he couldn't marry her, the emperor withdrew to a monastery. After his death, his body was embalmed and sprinkled with gold dust. He was arrayed in the imperial robes of yellow silk, seated in a canopied throne, and has remained in this position wonderfully lifelike after 300 years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
In Germany during the 19th century, all princes of the blood had a whipping boy. That is, a boy who was brought up with the young prince and who was spanked every time the prince misbehaved. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you where they sing the oldest song in the world. The shadoof is a water-raising device operating on the principle of the water sweep. It's been used for irrigation purposes in the Nile Valley for at least 5,000 years. The work of the shadoof has always been and still is accompanied by a song which has never changed in 50 centuries. It's sung by the farmers along the banks of the Nile in Egypt, making the shadoof easily the oldest song known to man. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
The surgeon, Dr. Politman, a native of Lorraine, died at the age of 140, having been drunk each day since he was 25 years old. On the eve of his death, he performed a major surgical operation successfully. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the first man to eat his hat. D.K. Thompson, a city estate agent of Melbourne, Australia, said that if he ever flunked a quiz, he would eat his hat. When he failed to answer his first question, he proceeded to keep his promise. He chopped up his stylish Panama hat and ate it, mixed with mashed potatoes and roast beef. Thousands of people blocked the street to gain a glimpse of the first hat eater in history. He said afterwards he would not recommend it as being at all appetizing. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
Glass does not have one of the properties of solids. It does not show any crystals with definite form, it flows with gravity, and it has no melting point. Therefore, glass is not a solid, it's a liquid. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you who was the first president of the United States. George Washington was not the first president of the United States. The Continental Congress met from 1774 on, but it was not until 1781, when Maryland finally signed the Articles of Confederation, that a union of all the original 13 states became an actuality. Who then was the first president, if not Washington? John Hanson, who signed for Maryland, was elected president of the United States in Congress assembled in 1781. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
Frank Damick of Chicago had a strange hobby. He compiled a complete deck of cards by picking them up from time to time in the street. After 10 years, he was 15 cards short. To complete his deck took another 20 years, believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a whale that swallowed a man. Scientists declare that although the whale is the largest animal that ever lived, its throat is so small it'll choke on a herring. So the cachalot, or the sperm whale, may have been the great fish mentioned in the Bible as the one that swallowed Jonah. Proof of this is in the report of the French scientist M. de Parville in the journal De Debate 1914. It's an account of James Bartley, an English sailor who was swallowed by a whale and later rescued. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Did you know that adding 4 or 5 drops of black paint to a pail of white paint will make the white paint more purely white? It will. The black drops act as a bleaching agent, making it whiter. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a fire that destroyed a concrete bridge. In the year 1922, a heavy rainfall caused driftwood to accumulate under and around a concrete bridge over the Navasota River in Limestone County, Texas. At the same time, a pipeline of the Mahia Oil Company nearby broke and released oil that drained into the river and saturated the driftwood. This oil-soaked mass caught fire and burned so fiercely that the heat caused the concrete bridge to crumble and fall apart. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
The will of Akbar the Great contained these words: every man should have 4 wives, a Hindu to bear children, a Persian for conversation, an Afghan to keep house, and a Turk to beat up as an example to the others. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man buried in a living tomb. In the village of Novdenitz, Germany, there stands a majestic oak tree. It was Hans Wilhelm von Thummel's wish that this great oak, which he admired so much in life, should serve him after death as a tomb. Von Thummel died on March 1st, 1824. He was wrapped simply in linen cloth and placed in a hollow in the tree. This living tomb wrapped itself around him until the breach healed. There von Thummel sleeps in peace and privacy. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
A Hindu ascetic of Singapore walked 3 miles in the blazing sun with 50 spears embedded in his flesh. This shows how much torment the human body can stand under certain mental conditions. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the world's worst thug. The Thuggee sect was a gang of professional murderers who flourished in India in 1830 before they were suppressed by the English. They were worshippers of Bhavani, and to this god they sacrificed anybody that came handy. However, they were careful to keep the dead man's things themselves, as they believed the god cared only for the corpse. The world's worst thug was Dhiram. In 40 years, he gleefully murdered 931 men. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
In Massachusetts, there is a lake called Chargagagog, Manchow, Gagagchow, Bunagung, Amog, which means, in the Indian language, you fish on your side, I fish on my side, nobody shall fish in the middle. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the fantastic wealth of King David. According to the Bible, David, king of Israel, possessed 103,000 talents of gold and 1,007,000 talents of silver. The intrinsic value of this hoard is $6,041,700,000. Today, this would equal $120 billion, or more than twice the cash available in the United States. This made David twice as rich as the richest country in the world. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The entire Dutch fleet was captured by the French cavalry in 1795. The Dutch ships were powerful but icebound in the Zuider Zee. The hussars galloped across the frozen sea and captured the fleet. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the Mystery House. The Mystery House of Santa Clara Valley, California, is one of the strangest testimonials of human eccentricity. It contained walled-up entrances, closet doors opening upon blank walls, trapdoors, and stairways leading nowhere. Its builder believed she would live as long as she kept adding rooms to this house. Her rambling mansion became a mystic maze of 144 rooms. She kept carpenters busy for 38 years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Giuseppe De Mai of Naples was paid $15,000 by the London Academy of Medicine for the right to dissect his body after death. Of course, De Mai was an unusual man. He had two separate and distinct hearts. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a strange fish that can travel on land. The crawling fish, a native of Asia, is remarkable for its apparent disregard of certain natural laws. This singular creature has long been noted for its powers of voluntarily leaving the failing streams, ascending the banks, and proceeding over dry land toward some spot where its unerring instinct tells it that water is yet to be found. They sometimes cover a distance of a mile or more and can live for a week out of water. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The weeping willow of Fishtoft originally was a stake which had been driven into the heart of a suicide buried at the crossroads in the village of Fishtoft. The stake took root and grew into a tree. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you a little-known story behind a popular musical instrument. Ancient Egypt is the mother country of a very popular musical instrument, which later became known in ancient Persia. It was the favorite instrument of antique Greece and Rome, and appears on a coin of Emperor Nero, who was a proficient performer on it. The martial music of the Roman legions was supplied by it, and the invading Romans introduced it into the British Isles. Eventually, it came into favor in Scotland. They adopted it, and today we know it as the bagpipe. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
General Townsend of London could control the palpitation of his heart and suspend its action entirely at will. But he tried it once too often. He died 8 days after suspending his heart action for half an hour. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story behind the name Manhattan. The Indian word for Manhattan is Manahatta. This name is traceable to the year 1524 when Giovanni Verrazzano, the Florentine explorer, landed for the first time at what is now the lower extremity of New York City. He gave the Indians their first taste of firewater. A good time was had by all, and ever after the natives referred to the island as Manahatta, which in their Indian tongue meant the place of drunkenness. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The Curtis family of London maintained an unbroken line of doctors in the family for 224 years, until September 25th, 1927, when the last of this long line, Dr. William Curtis, died. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about some girls who sure have a lot of lip. Beauty, of course, is a matter of personal opinion, but surely nowhere in the world do people have stranger opinions than the Saurus dingus of Africa. The large lips of their girls are the result of one of the most astonishing customs. Their lips are pierced with wooden discs of increasing size to stretch the lower lip. After some time, the overgrowth of lip becomes so enormous that the lower lip is distended large enough that a 14-inch soup plate can be worn. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
There is a statue in the form of a lioness without a tongue, which was erected to Leona, the Athenian courtesan. To prevent herself from revealing a conspiracy, she bit off her own tongue. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the frightening story of the man who fell out of a plane. During World War I, Lieutenant Makepeace, a Canadian flying officer, and Captain Headley, an observer, were in their plane when they were attacked over German lines. In the running fight that ensued, the plane made a sudden vertical dive. Headley was dislodged from the plane. He fell several hundred feet in a direct line with the plane, but luck certainly was with him, for he alighted on the tail of the same plane, and clinging there, he was brought down to safety. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
H.B. Applegate of Ogallala, Nebraska, really wanted to find out how the fish were biting. He anchored his boat at one point in the San Juan River and fished in 4 states, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how owning too much real estate wrecked a man's fortune. In 1621, Sir William Alexander, Earl of Stirling, received from King James I a charter granting him in all perpetuity Nova Scotia and practically all of Canada. King Charles I not only confirmed this grant, but enlarged it to include part of the present northern United States. Sir William invested $1 million in an attempt to improve the tremendous territory given to him, and staggering as the gift was, he wrecked his fortune and died insolvent. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Pierre Loti, on the occasion of his initiation ceremony as a member of the French Academy in 1892, told his fellow members he had never read anything. Strange when you consider Pierre, who had never read a book, was an author. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how the tank got its name. The British first began to build armored cars based on the American Caterpillar tractor in 1915. It was feared that the enemy might learn of the new weapon too soon. As a result, the factory foremen were instructed to reply to questions that the strange vehicles were cisterns built to carry water to the British troops in the Sahara Desert. They were known as cisterns for some time. Eventually, a shorter word meaning the same thing was substituted. The word was tank. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The longest name yet wished on a helpless infant was bestowed some years back upon the daughter of Arthur Pepper, Liverpool, England. Her initials exhausted the alphabet from Anna to Zeno. They called her Alphabet Pepper for short. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you an unusual story about a wedding at knife point. The peoples of the world have many odd ways of getting married. In parts of India, a girl must marry a tree before she can marry the man of her choice. And there's a tribe of Kabyas in Morocco where the marriage ceremony is really sharp. The priest sticks the point of a knife against the bride's throat. As soon as he's drawn a single drop of blood, she's a married woman. This is by way of impressing her that symbolically she'll be at the mercy of her husband. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe it or not.
Gentleman Jim Corbett was the first great exponent of cleverness inside the rope. Here is testimony to his remarkable skill. Jim fought in the prize ring for 18 years and never had a black eye or a bloody nose. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a bloody war that was fought over the sex of a bear. A bear is the emblem of the two neighboring Swiss cantons of Appenzell and St. Gall. In 1579, St. Gall published an almanac in which they described their own emblem as a male bear and the Appenzell bear as a female. Appenzell demanded that their neighbors retract this insult. St. Gall refused, and costly battles were fought for 2 years. Thousands died before St. Gall solemnly declared that the bear on their neighbor's emblem was a male. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
In Colomiers, France, 1792 is a family name. The 1792 family had 4 sons named January, February, March, and April. March 1792 died in September 1904. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the first man to receive double pay for overtime. While painting the Last Judgment in the Vatican, the fresco which is considered the world's most famous work of art, Michelangelo contracted with Pope Paul III in 1536 that he would draw 1 ducat daily for work performed in the daytime and 2 ducats for work after sundown. He made himself a hood into which he stuck a lighted candle. This permitted him to see his work after dark, making Michelangelo the first man to receive double pay for overtime. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Moulay Ismail was the real father of his country. He ruled Morocco for 57 years, and when he died in 1727, he had fathered 540 boys and 340 girls. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the peculiar story of an empire that was lost because of a butterfly. In 1802, France and England sent ships to establish a colony in what is now the state of Victoria in Australia. The Frenchmen arrived first. A few days later, the British ship arrived. The French bark was still there, but its occupants had gone into the interior to hunt for an Australian butterfly. The French returned with their butterfly, but by that time, the British were firmly in possession. Thus, a beautiful butterfly cost France an empire of 87,000 square miles. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
On March 28, 193 A.D., the Roman world was offered for sale at auction by the all-powerful Praetorian Guard. Didius Julianus, a wealthy Roman merchant, bought it for the equivalent of 5 million in gold. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the girl all royalty wanted to marry. In the 1600s, Portugal was the richest and most prosperous country in Europe. The daughter of the king commanded a fabulous dowry, which dazzled all the crowned heads. Isabel Louise, daughter of Dom Pedro II of Portugal, was considered such a catch. At the age of 8, an emperor, 10 princes, 2 dukes, and 2 bishops demanded her hand in marriage. She turned them all down, and in 1690 she died, an old spinster of 21. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Caligula, the Roman emperor, bestowed the rank of consul and co-regent upon Incitatus. He was accorded every honor of the office and was provided with a golden drinking goblet and an ivory manger, for Incitatus was a horse. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the ship of the dead. On September 22, 1860, the whaling schooner Hope was operating in the Southern Ocean south of the Drake Straits when the walls of an ice barrier parted and revealed one of the strangest crafts ever seen on the seas. It was the schooner Jenny, caught in an ice jam on January 17th, 1823. She had just been released from the death grip of ice, her frozen passengers still aboard after 37 years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
Some of the world's greatest marksmen live underwater. The Ketodon fish of India has a beak-like muzzle and uses it to shoot insects. His ammunition, drops of water. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you just how long true love can go on. Janos Robin and his wife Sarah had 2 golden weddings and almost lived to see a third. They'd been married 147 years when they died on almost the same day in Hungary in 1925. Janos was 172, Sarah was 164. At their bedside when they died was their son, age 116. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
How long would it take you to make change for $5 in all possible combinations? At the rate of 1 change a second, it would take you 103 years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about some very dangerous clams. Man has eaten clams for a long time. But did you know that clams have also eaten men? The mammoth clams of Malaysia are sure death to anyone careless enough to step across their open jaws. Over the years, many natives have died and been eaten in this manner. You see, these huge Malaysian clams average 4 feet across and weigh nearly 500 pounds. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
Nero did not fiddle while Rome burned. You see, the fiddle had not been invented yet, and Nero was 50 miles away in Antium during the fire and did not return until Rome was in ashes. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a small fish that can kill a shark. A fish less than a foot long can kill a shark. The little urchin fish of South America frequently destroys savage monsters 25 times its size in a most unusual manner. This fish is covered with spiny points, much like porcupine quills. When swallowed by a shark, it rolls into a ball and calmly eats and bores its way out completely through the sides of the shark, thus killing it. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley. Believe it or not.
Bad news travels fast. If there was a murder at midnight and everyone who was told about it told 2 other persons within 12 minutes, everyone on earth would know about it by morning. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a deadly news item. If you think your life a bit dead, listen to the following news item from the Barstow, California Times. It reads, quote, Bill Jarrett has just returned from the Death Valley country. Bill worked for 6 weeks on the graveyard shift for the corpse mining company in the Coffin Mine located in Dead Man's Canyon in Funeral Range at the end of Death Valley. Bill is leaving next week for a prospecting trip to the Devil's Playground in Hell's Half Acre, unquote. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
last bottle of the before Prohibition brew of a famous Milwaukee brewer was prized so highly that being the last of its kind, the manufacturer had it insured for $25,000. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you a story about Thanksgiving when it was known as a fast day. Until the year 1631, the Stern Pilgrims celebrated their Thanksgiving Day by rigorously abstaining from food and drink. In that year at Charlestown, the annual Thanksgiving Fast Day on February 5th was changed to a feast day for the first time to celebrate the long-awaited arrival of a ship which landed with provisions from Ireland. It was not until President Lincoln's time that Thanksgiving Day was generally designated for the last Thursday in November. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
W.M. Wood of Eastland, Texas, placed Old Rip, a horned toad, in the cornerstone of the courthouse in 1897 and took it out alive in 1928. Old Rip lived without food or water for 31 years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a deadly stone of slaughter. The National Museum in Mexico City houses the bloodiest spot on earth. There you'll see a carved circular stone about 7 feet across. This sacrificial stone was used by the ancient Aztecs. Although the Aztecs were a comparatively mild and peaceful people who attained a high degree of civilization, they believed in human sacrifice. On this stone, more than 1 million human beings have had their hearts cut out. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
One of the most amazing funerals of all time took place in the townhouse of the Roman poet Virgil. Amid barbaric pomp and splendor, Virgil spent $100,000 to bury his pet fly. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the donkey that discovered a mine worth $100 million. A lost donkey wandering aimlessly over the Idaho hills accidentally stumbled on the greatest silver lead mine in the United States. The donkey had been borrowed by 2 prospectors, O'Rourke and Kellogg. As the prospectors had only borrowed the donkey, the owner of the animal claimed the property. Judge Norman Buck, District Court of Idaho, in 1885, declared the official discoverer of the mine was the donkey, and the owner of the donkey obtained title to a half interest. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
General Jan Žižka, Bohemian Hussite leader, had a strange request on his deathbed. He directed that his skin be made into a military drum so that even after death he might still lead his soldiers against the Germans. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a real distance runner. Menson Ernst, a Norwegian, was the greatest long-distance runner who ever lived. He ran from Paris to Moscow in 2 weeks, over poor roads in all kinds of weather, and swam 13 rivers on the way, yet he averaged 125 miles a day. He averaged 95 miles a day for 59 days in a race from Constantinople to Calcutta and return, a distance of 5,625 miles. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
5 letter blocks contain a total of 30 letters. All the people in the world working day and night for 1 million years could not arrange these 5 letter blocks into all possible combinations. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the uncanny story of a bullet that found its mark. Early in February 1928, A.V. Bonham of Cotter, Arkansas, saw smoke and was startled to learn it was at his own house. With the aid of neighbors, Bonham removed most of his household goods, but he overlooked a loaded revolver in his bureau drawer. As he stood watching the flames, a pistol report rang out, and Bonham cried, "I'm shot!" He staggered a few steps and fell dead. The heat had exploded a cartridge in his gun, and the bullet found its mark. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Here's a real brain teaser for you. Did you know that if all the Chinese in the world were to march four abreast past a given point, they would never finish passing, although they marched forever and ever? Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you one of history's most curious coincidences. When General Eisenhower invaded Normandy in 1944, he trod the same soil from whence William the Conqueror embarked on the conquest of England. Just before the battle, a Norman knight named Taillefer obtained William's permission to strike the first blow. The knight's name, Taillefer, is identical in meaning with the name Eisenhower. They both mean Smith. Taillefer died on October 14th, 1066. Eisenhower was born October 14th, 1890. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Charles Coghlan died in 1899 and was buried in Galveston. When the flood came, his coffin was washed out to sea, and the Gulf Stream carried him around Florida, 2,000 miles to Prince Edward Island, where he had lived. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about King Plenty and his 415 wives. King Plenty's full name was Plenty Wife, Plenty Trouble. He ruled the Congo and Africa for 21 years. He differed from most royal polygamists in that he showed a marked preference for sisters. Among his wives was one set of 55 sisters and another set of 35, each set including only the daughters of the same father. Smaller sister teams constituted the balance. Of course, his special achievement was obviously that he was his own brother-in-law about 100 times over. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Reb Fromer did not speak a word or utter a sound for 30 years. This remarkable penance was self-imposed. It seems that Fromer, in an outburst of temper, cursed his bride, who soon after met with a violent death. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a general's small margin of defeat. General Francis Marion Cockrell of Missouri lost the governorship by the smallest margin in history. At the time, each county in the state was represented by a full delegate if it had at least 500 inhabitants. If a county had less, the representation was prorated. Some counties were entitled to only 1/6 of a vote. General Cockrell was defeated by Charles H. Hardin in 1864. He lost by 1/6 of a vote. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Albert Einstein, the great mathematician and author of the theory of relativity, truly was a genius. However, when he was 16, he failed his entrance exams at the Federal Polytechnic College of Zurich. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how 458 women were convicted of the murder of one man. Idolambi Nkabinda, a moneylender in South Africa, was stoned and clubbed to death by villagers when he came to collect some money owed him. Practically every woman in the village admitted to having taken part in the slaying. In April 1939, they were brought to trial, and 458 were found guilty of homicide and sentenced to serve from 3 to 6 months in jail. A total of nearly 120 years for the crime. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Madame de la Brace, a French eccentric, left her fortune of 125,000 francs for a strange purpose. She specified that the money be used for buying clothes for snowmen. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you an unusual story of a man and his anniversaries. Henri Nevers, a fisherman of Tréport, France, celebrated a golden wedding with one wife and 2 silver weddings with 2 wives in succession. He married in 1809 and celebrated a golden wedding anniversary in 1859. He married his second wife in 1860 and observed a silver anniversary with her in 1885. In the same year, he married again and celebrated a second silver anniversary in 1910. He died at the age of 121, believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
If you like to cook and you have an unusually large kettle, C.N. Robinson of New Zealand had just the dish for you. In 1928, he grew beans more than 6 feet long and 10 to 17 inches around. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the whiskers that caused a war. The most fateful whiskers in history belong to King Louis VII of France. After the king returned from the Crusades, he decided to shave off his whiskers. The result was the Queen declared she had lost her affection for him. She obtained a divorce and married King Henry II of England. Louis declared war upon Henry, and this war between England and France did not end until after the Battle of Rouen, 301 years later. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The annual pin-sticking contest is a bizarre amusement of the rural population of the Wattawa section of Bohemia. In 1928, Bagro, a gypsy king, carried off the honors by embedding 3,200 needles in his arm. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of the human lighthouse. The lighthouse man of Chongqing, China, was a peculiar man, to say the least. He went about the streets at night with a lighted red candle 7 or 8 inches in length stuck in the vertex of his skull. He sometimes would act as a human lantern and light the way for Western travelers down the dark and dismal alleys of Chongqing. He was frequently used in this capacity by Robert Smythe, the U.S. consul in China, and by some officers of the U.S. Navy. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
I think you'll agree that a gallon of wine would be a lot to drink during an entire evening. However, Novelius Torquatus of Milan could drink 3 gallons of wine at one draught without taking a breath. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the incredible reward the Duchess gave a stable boy. Giulia Gonzaga, widowed Duchess of Fondi, Italy, was so incredibly beautiful that Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent wanted her for his harem. He sent the Turkish Navy 1,000 galleys strong to Italy to capture her. A stable boy learned of the plot and, placing the Duchess on his horse, rode all night to save her. The beautiful Duchess repaid the stable boy the next morning. She ordered his head cut off. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Wilhelm von Hohenzollern, the ex-Kaiser, was reputed to be worth $100 million. Both the German and the Dutch governments granted him immunity from taxes. Thus, one of the richest men in the world paid no taxes. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the craziest command ever given. Tsar Paul I of Russia, known to history as the Mad Tsar, was a man with an uncontrollable temper. In 1799, he was reviewing his bodyguard and became displeased with a button on a soldier's cloak. The emperor's face became livid with rage, and he ordered, "About face, march." Without a murmur, 400 men, the pick of the army, set out on a 2,000-mile trek into Siberia and were never heard of again. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Sebastian Spinola, famous dancing master of the 16th century, known as the father of the French ballet, achieved this distinction in spite of the fact that both of his legs were amputated at the knees when he was a boy of 11. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a daughter's strange sacrifice. The gigantic bell in the temple of Ta Chun Tzu was cast at the order of the Chinese Emperor Yang Lo. The bell caster made 2 unsuccessful attempts at casting. The emperor warned that a third failure would result in his execution. A soothsayer told the bell caster that only the sacrifice of a pure maiden would result in a perfect bell. The bell caster's daughter heard the statement and leaped into the kiln, sacrificing her life for a perfect bell. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
The woeful walls of Meknes in Morocco were built for Muley Ismail. It took 50,000 European slaves 20 years to build the city, and their dead bodies were buried in the walls to make them strong. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how the card game bridge got its name. The card game bridge originated in Istanbul, Turkey, where the Russian colony first played it under the name of Russian whist. It was brought to England about 1884. 2 English families used to visit one another on alternate nights to play the game. Their way led across a rickety, unsafe old bridge. On parting, the visiting family would sigh with relief and say, "Thank goodness it's your bridge tomorrow night." Gradually, the game became known as bridge, whist, and finally bridge. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
A little-known part of Paraguay in South America, in the region of the Parana River near the border of Brazil, is the wettest spot on Earth. Rain has been falling there continuously for millions of years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the greatest wastrel of the 19th century. Paul Antal Esterhazy, Prince of Galanta, was the owner of the most princely fortune on the European continent. His personal property included 21 castles, 60 boroughs, and 621 villages. He squandered about $9,600,000. His 2 most talked-about stunts were the shooting of his Derby winner and the destruction of a priceless Titian painting with which he lined his coat. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Mrs. Teresa Vaughan, aged 24, was arraigned in the police court of Sheffield, England, on December 19, 1922, on a charge of bigamy. She confessed to 61 marriages in 5 years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how a building was saved by a shrieking statue. In 1799, Thomas Bruce, the British ambassador, obtained the permission of the Turkish authorities to tear down the Erechtheum, the famous temple situated on the Acropolis in the Grecian capital. He planned to rebuild it in London. The demolition began at night. They had hardly started dismantling it when an unexplainable event occurred. A statue shrieked. The laborers fled in terror, and the plan was abandoned. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
John Howard Payne was a wanderer all his life. He once wrote to a friend that he never had a home and never expected to have one. Strange that Mr. Payne, author of Home...
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Joe Land of Winnipeg, Canada, went a little off course when he was golfing one day. He drove a golf ball 52 miles cross-country. We're not sure what cross-country par is, but Joe did it in 753 strokes. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a most frivolous death sentence. Marshko Komyakov, a Russian, was an enthusiastic chess player. In a critical game one day, he confused the king with the queen and soundly cursed the chess king, which is Tsar in Russian. Some servile soul reported the incident to the authorities. Although it was clear that he was referring to a chess piece and not the monarch, he was sentenced to death. But at the last moment, the Tsar commuted the sentence to deportation to Siberia for life. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the truth. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Harold Dobbins, government trapper of Ione, Oregon, found a newspaper account of his appointment in the stomach of a coyote he caught. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a contractor who built a house to save his life. Reddish Hall near Didsbury, England, was under construction in 1657 when the building contractor was tried and convicted of a murder. After his death sentence was pronounced, the condemned man requested a delay of his execution, long enough for him to complete the structure. Strangely enough, the court agreed to his request. Of course, the builder was in no hurry to die, and he kept building and stalling until he died of natural causes. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the truth. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Mrs. Cordelia Stewart of San Jose, California, swallowed a needle in childhood. Years later, the needle emerged from the thigh of her baby daughter. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about 1/2 cent that started a war. A bloody war was fought over a coin worth 1/2 cent, which a tax collector tried to extract from a poor farmer on the island of Corsica. The taxpayer's countrymen became infuriated and took up arms in defense of the farmer. Genoa landed a large army on the island, opening warfare which lasted 44 years and cost 80,000 casualties and untold treasure. Corsicans are proud that the 1/2 cent tax delinquency remains unpaid. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the truth. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
In this era of the coin shortage, consider the Commonwealth, a Massachusetts penny coined in 1787 and 1788. It cost 2 cents to mint. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the woman who survived the hangman's noose. Mary Green was hanged by the neck at Newgate Prison in London on March 22nd, 1819. She'd been convicted of passing counterfeit banknotes. After being declared officially dead, her body was turned over to her next of kin for burial. An alert relative detected a spark of life and quickly summoned a doctor. He wasted no time and in 20 minutes of resuscitation restored her to life. She survived under another name and identity for 15 more years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the truth. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
There is a new electronic gauge used in manufacturing airplane instruments which can measure the depth of a mouse's footprints on a strand of wire. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a tree that has to be scared into a year's growth. Near Palma, on the Spanish island of Mallorca, there's an old olive tree growing which has to be scared into a year's growth each spring. For the last 400 years, the owners of the tree, aided by their neighbors, have assembled around it to beat loud drums and shake giant rattles till the tree appears to be sufficiently frightened. Without the scare, the hollow tree would neither blossom nor bear fruit for an entire year. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the truth. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
No Balthasar Nussbaumer, an Austrian mountain climber, hurtled 1,000 feet down Mount Grossvenediger when a rope broke. Yet he walked away unharmed, believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a custom which would be very unpopular in America. The Bills, an aboriginal tribe inhabiting a wild and hilly country in central India, have a very unpopular custom indeed, at least to most of the world. On the day when a couple are married, the bride places a fragrant leaf between her lips. The husband reduces the leaf with his teeth, bite by bite, until their lips meet. Sound romantic? Not so at all. It's the only kiss they're allowed for the rest of their married lives. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Some people may live in glass houses, but Raymond Isidore of Chartres, France, made his home and all of its furnishings out of 1 million broken dishes. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about some people who found a sure way to reduce the divorce rate. On the island of St. Kilda in the Hebrides, Scotland, a young man wishing to marry had to climb to the top of Lover's Rock, 850 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. There on the jutting edge, he had to balance on one leg. It took acrobatic skill and courage. Loss of balance meant certain death below, the most grueling premarital test known. Rather than face it again, Swains, once wed, stayed wed. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
There is an unusual lighthouse in Ulverston, England. In over 112 years, it has never once been lit. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about one of the most desperate stratagems ever used by a warrior. General Zopyros was one of the military commanders of the Persian king Darius the Great when the latter laid siege to the city of Babylon. Zopyros cut off his nose and his ears and fled inside the beleaguered metropolis, pretending to be a victim of Darius's inhumanity and thirsting for vengeance. The Babylonians offered to make him chief defender of the city. He accepted, and once in possession of supreme authority, promptly surrendered Babylon to his king. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Here is a statistic to ponder. The chances of two typewriters producing typed words exactly alike are 3 trillion to 1. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a woman who really knew how to live. Mrs. Harriet Ross of Northeast Margaree, Nova Scotia, was first married in her native France at the age of 13. She lost her first husband by drowning. Her second husband was a Captain Briand of the French Army who was stationed in French Canada. He was killed in the siege of Louisbourg. She married a third time to James Ross. She died at the age of 119, 102 years after the death of her second husband. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Westminster Abbey, or the Church of St. Peter, was stripped of its bells in favor of the newly constructed St. Paul's Cathedral. This was the origin of the famous expression, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a weird death watch. John Druitt of Horsham, England, committed a crime for which his son was hanged on April 13th, 1799. The crime was robbery of a mail coach, which was punishable by death in the 18th century. The father later performed a weird atonement. He sat day and night beneath the gibbet on which his son's body was left hanging. 4 years later, in sight of his son's skeleton, he finally died. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Here is an instance where the United States literally applauds Canada. The International Opera House in Rock Island, Quebec, has its stage in Canada, and the audience sits in the United States. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a very costly cup of butter. In 1607, the owner of the town of Shirhati in the state of Sangli, India, was an Indian magnate named Anushkar. One night while playing chess with his wife, the light of the oil lamp began to sputter. Wanting to finish the game, Anushkar offered to trade the town for a cup full of oil. A woman named Desai took the magnate at his word and furnished some purified melted butter. She held him to his word, and as a result, the town was traded for a cup full of melted butter. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
An automobile that collided with a hydropole in St. Mary's, Ontario, Canada, was quickly located by the police. They found an imprint of the license plate on the pole. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a doctor who had to make a strange life and death decision. Dr. Mukarram, chief physician to Shah Jahan, the Mughal emperor of India, was an honorable man. When his master Shah Jahan was overthrown by his son Aurangzeb in 1658, the new emperor summoned the physician and ordered him to administer poison to the deposed monarch under the guise of a prescription. His honor and doctor's principles would not let him murder a patient, so he solved the dilemma by swallowing the poison himself. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Captain Joseph Hay of Edinburgh, Scotland, always wore a long veil in public so he could ogle passing ladies without arousing the indignation of their escorts. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the girl who jilted a king. Her name was Chakhi Nabat, its meaning a piece of sugar. She was so enchanting that she inflamed the hearts of two of the most prominent men of her age. One was Suja, king of the Persian province of Fars, and the other a local boy of her native Shiraz whose name was Hafiz. He was one of Persia's immortal poets, a master of lyricism and glowing imagery. She jilted her king and married the poet, but she did not live happily ever after. The poet was a brute who mistreated her, causing her early death. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
In ancient Sparta, an elected official was required to get intoxicated every day and reel through the streets. It was an object lesson for the young citizenry. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a wig that was thought to be smarter than the head who wore it. Henry Andrews, an astronomical calculator for the British Board of Longitude and publisher of Old Moore's Almanac for 40 years, was described as one of the best astronomers of the age. He died in 1820, but his wig continued to adorn another head for half a century longer. The man who succeeded Andrews was an astronomer named William Rogerson. He believed that all of the dead man's learning resided in his wig, and that he would inherit his talents by simply wearing the hairpiece. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
A fly alighting on a steel bar will cause the steel to bend under its weight. An instrument called an interferometer can detect the deflection. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about Lekhomalo, the human top. The chiefs of the Bashhalili tribe in the Republic of the Congo rate along lupungu, a wraparound dancing skirt made of the fiber of raffia palm leaves. While dressing for a dance, the chief has two attendants hold up the 18-yard-long skirt. He spins into it by performing 18 pirouettes. A chief named Lakomalo demonstrated his nimbleness by performing a total of 58,000 pirouettes. The non-stop exhibition required 18 solid hours, believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Herring rained from the sky near Sheen, Argyllshire, Scotland in March 1817. A shower of young herring about 3 inches long pelted the fields and lasted about an hour. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how milking a cow saved a woman's life. In Islington, England, Alice Owen was watching a maid milking a cow and inquired if she might try her hand at milking. As she bent down to the task, an arrow whizzed overhead and passed right through the crown of her hat. Had she been erect, it could not have failed to kill her. In gratitude for her deliverance, in 1613, she built a free school. Owen's School is still in use. It's located on the spot where she so narrowly escaped death. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Jingling Lane in Kirkby, Lonsdale, England got its name because when you walk there, every step produces the sound of a jingling bell. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how a man got his revenge 5 years after he was executed. Sir John Fenwick was sentenced to death for conspiring to assassinate King William III of England. He was avenged 5 years after his beheading. The doomed man had thrown himself upon the king's mercy, but the king refused to intervene. Before he was executed, Fenwick asked that his favorite horse, Sorrel, be given to the king. Nearly 5 years later, while the monarch was riding, Sorrel stumbled and threw the rider. The king sustained a broken neck and died. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The Massachusetts Historical Society has preserved a bottle containing some tea salvaged from Boston Harbor during the famous Boston Tea Party on December 16th, 1773. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man who was executed by a firing squad 4 successive times. Daniel McMichael in Scotland had been sentenced to death in absentia. He was sick in bed with fever when he heard that a detachment of soldiers was about to capture him. He fled, but was overtaken at the pass of Daldine. A firing squad was ordered to execute him, but the soldiers, moved by compassion at the shaky, fever-racked man, missed him deliberately 3 times. The commander ordered a 4th try. This time, the bullets found their mark, ending Daniel McMichael's charmed life. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Agnes Sorel, favorite of King Charles VIII of France, was the first woman to wear diamonds. It was in her day that the art of cutting diamonds was first mastered. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a woman who had 600 eyebrows. When beautiful Venetia Anastasia Hanley married Sir Kenelm Digby in 1625, she brought 300 pairs of false eyebrows into the marriage. Each pair was different in size, shape, and color. Public gossip was that she never wore the same pair of eyebrows on 2 successive days. When she died, the inventory set up for the benefit of the surrogate's court listed among the movable assets 300 pairs of slightly used eyebrows assorted. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The anonymous statue in Budapest, Hungary was erected to commemorate a 12th century historian whose name no one can remember, believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a place where they have the most picturesque wedding ceremony on earth. The Lalas of Africa have the most picturesque wedding ceremony on earth. The marriage rites consist of having the bride's portrait painted on a framed canvas which the groom wears on his nuptial headdress. However, the divorce proceedings are even simpler. The husband erases his wife's features from the wedding frame, and presently she not only passes out of the picture, she passes out of his life. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Henry Obermeyer of New York City, while sitting at the same table at the same party, won the door prize, a new automobile, for 2 successive years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the long rain. Mokham Singh and his son and successor Raghunath Singh ruled the state of Jharkhand for a combined period of 147 years. The father's reign covered 75 years, while his son continued to sit on the throne for an additional 72 years. The son, who had vowed to top his father's regal record, was prevented from realizing his ambition by premature death. He died in battle at the age of 92. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The palace of Shazma Shahi in Srinagar, Kashmir, has been air-conditioned for 400 years. It's still cooled by a river that was diverted to run through it in the 16th century. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man who could not count to 1 million. Shamil, a Caucasian leader who waged holy war against the Russians for 25 years, once captured the Tsar's uncle in an ambush. He was offered 1 million rubles in ransom, but he slyly refused it. "I will not accept 1 kopeck less than 5,000 rubles, he announced. Actually, he had no idea how much 1 million was. Later, Shamil was superseded by another native son, one Yosef Jugashvili, whose conspiratorial name was Stalin. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The oldest cattle brand, crosses plus a number, was found engraved upon the wall of an ancient Egyptian tomb dating back more than 3,000 years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you a story concerning the treachery of kings. King Edward IV of England was warned by an astrologer that one of his brothers, whose name began with the letter G, would murder the king's 2 sons. As a result of this macabre prediction, the king ordered his brother George drowned in a cask of wine. His foul deed did not save the lives of his sons. The 2 princes were subsequently executed by the king's other brother, the Duke of Gloucester, who was then crowned as Richard III. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
In the Olemba tribe in Africa, the prospective bridegroom must pay for his wife in an odd way. There, the standard price of a wife is 4 native dogs. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a very unusual coincidence in a man's life. If I died this hour, I should die happy. Thus spoke John Liston, the celebrated English comedian, on Sunday, March 22nd in 1807 at 10:30 a.m. At the time he said it, he was being married in the church of St. Martin's in the Field. By a striking coincidence, 39 years later, as the clock struck 10:30 a.m. on Sunday, March 22nd, 1846, Liston died in his wife's arms. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
In Bridgnorth, England, there is a castle that refuses to fall. It was blown up in 1651 and has been defying gravity for 305 years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you why you can't always rely on doves. Richard Duncan of Kinkell, Scotland, was convicted of killing a child and was hanged for it in 1683. He told his executioners that a white dove would alight on the gallows in token of his innocence. His prediction came true. A white dove settled on the gallows immediately after Duncan's body was removed. But Duncan was guilty beyond doubt, and the uncalled-for appearance of the white dove is a disappointing ending to a sordid story. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The obelisk of Corunna, Spain is topped off by 4 clocks, each of which shows a different time. This was done so that couples meeting there will never be late. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man who witnessed a very unusual incident. Captain Edward Sabine, noted English astronomer, went to Africa on behalf of the Royal Institute. On Cape Lopez in French Equatorial Africa, he witnessed the wreck of a ship and saw the buoyant cargo rise to the surface and drift out of sight. A year later, Sabine was sent to Hammerfest, Norway. There he saw the same barrels wash ashore at the end of a 6,250-mile drift. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Here's an interesting item for the bird watchers and the curious. The beak of a woodpecker moves forward and back with a speed of 100 miles per hour. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the strange story of the spectacles of death. Dominique Joseph Garat, Minister of Justice during the French Revolution, was given the frightful task of reading the death sentence to King Louis XVI. His great remorse concentrated on his gold-rimmed eyeglasses. He vowed never to see or wear them again. 40 years later, a curate visited Garat. He found the spectacles and tried them on. When Garat returned, the sight of the spectacles literally shocked him to death. The curate, who never suspected the fatal association, wore them while reading Garat's funeral services. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
This may come as a surprise to the ladies who own or have wanted to own an ermine wrap. The ermine, which is highly prized, and the stoat, which is detested, are one and the same animal. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the courage of a woman which few humans would dare to match. In 1843, the Countess Rosa Bronica traveled to Germany in search of medical advice. The German physicians diagnosed her ailment as cancer and urged immediate surgery. But the Countess, not wanting to alarm her family, secretly purchased surgical instruments. Then, locked in a room alone, she performed an astounding surgical operation on herself, successfully removing the cancerous tumor. She survived her surgery for 19 years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
A jet fighter has a refrigerating system with a freezing capacity equal to 176,000 ice cubes a day. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a ceremony which will tax your belief. The natives of the province of Imarina on the island of Madagascar enact annually a ceremony they refer to as Famadiana. There, time does not heal the grief of relatives who lose a kinsman through death. Each September, they dig up the bodies of their dear departed and provide them with a change of clothing. Then they reinter them in the same grave or transfer them to a new and showier sepulcher, depending on the state of the family's finances. This macabre ceremony is repeated until either the bereaved die or there is nothing left. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The only civilian who ever commanded a United States man of war was Robert B. Forbes. He commanded the USS Jamestown, which transported food to Ireland during the Irish famine of 1847. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the bride who didn't have a stitch to wear. On February 22nd, 1789, Major Moses Joy of Putney, Vermont, married Hannah, the widow of William Ward. The blushing bride was completely unclothed, except for a rough wooden box which enclosed her form. The law of the time made a second husband responsible for all the liabilities of his predecessor if the widow wore any clothing at all during the ceremony. All the finery the bride wore was a rough wooden box, and she lived happily ever after. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The French have a word which contradicts itself. Crevant is a French word which means both screamingly funny and deadly dull. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the white pigeons who are deadly jealous. May pure white pigeons always nest in the beams of your house. This was the traditional blessing of Ali bin Abu Talib, the son-in-law and successor of the Prophet Muhammad. Shortly after Ali's death, thousands of pure white pigeons took up their abode in the vicinity of his grave and have been there ever since. The pigeons rigorously police the precincts of the mosque. Should a pigeon with a single black feather attempt to join the flock, the white pigeons drive it away. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The heart of a hummingbird beats 20 times as fast as that of a human. The hummingbird's heart beats 1,400 times a minute. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about an army that killed with gold. Yaqub ibn Leach, known as Al-Safar, was originally a humble kettle mender who collected a band of desperate characters and became a bandit chief. When he conquered the throne of Khorasan, a large hoard of gold bullion came into his possession. He made use of the yellow metal in a strange way. He equipped 1,000 cavalrymen with war clubs, having 14-pound heads of solid gold. Today, each mace would be worth $7,000. 1,000 of them would be worth $14 million. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The musicians of ancient Greece had an unusual way of advertising their calling. They wore shoes that played music when they walked. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a different kind of marriage racket. Women of the Kabati tribe of Africa, who've had the misfortune of losing a husband, have adopted what may be described as a sound way of obtaining a new husband. Custom requires each to stay near the grave of the departed during the entire term of her widowhood. During her stay, she wields a stout club with which she drums a noisy tattoo on the resonant walls of the grave. She also uses her vocal cords to good advantage until some personable male looking for peace and quiet weds the noisy widow to shut her up. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Molese's house on the island of Inishmurray, Ireland, which was constructed entirely of loose stones without the use of mortar, has endured for 1,400 years, believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a ballet star who built a cathedral. The Roman Catholic Cathedral of Our Lady and the Martyrs in Cambridge, England, was built through the generosity of one donor. Madame Lynn Stevens, a native of Paris, had been a ballet star in her youth, but left the stage to marry Lynn Stevens, a wealthy English banker. Later, she calculated her stage earnings, added the interest for 42 years, which totaled $500,000. This she donated for the construction of the cathedral in the English city of her adoption. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Fortune tellers in rural England still use magic cubes, which are made from the blood of a mouse, a dove, and a toad, the eyes of a crab, and moss collected from a graveyard. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you an unusual story about a soldier who became a celebrated painter. Ludimir Benediktowicz, a Polish soldier, lost both hands while fighting the Russians in the Polish uprising of 1863. The 19-year-old youth decided to become a painter. He specialized in vast historical scenes, wielding the brush by means of a hook fastened around the stump of his right arm. Ludimir attained great renown both as an artist and a chess player, while mastering his crippling disability for the next 63 years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
A globe in the University of Krakow, Poland, built of solid gold in 1509, was the first in history to include the American continent. It identifies America as a reported new land. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man who paid a fortune for a single letter of the alphabet. Mahmud al-Ghazni, king of Afghanistan, was granted the title of Vali by the Caliph Qaden Billah. But Vali can mean either lord or servant. As a result, Mahmud paid the Caliph 100,000 golden drachma to clarify his rank by changing his title to V-A-A-L-I, spelled with two A's instead of the usual one A. He paid the equivalent of $250,000 for a single letter of the alphabet. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
If you have a sweet tooth that's hard to satisfy, you can be happy you didn't live in 17th century England. In those days, a pound of sugar cost as much as 14 chickens. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how a game of chess was fatal to a sultan. Sultan Malik al-Salif Najim al-Dain Ayub ruled Egypt from 1240 to 1249. The monarch incurred the hatred of his wife, who decided to liquidate her husband. He was a chess addict who played the game every night, squatting barefoot on the floor in Oriental fashion. On the night of November 20th, 1249, the queen saturated the floor mat with some highly corrosive substance. As a result, the sultan contracted a gangrenous sore and died 48 hours later. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Thomas Schweiker of Schwäbisch Hall, Germany, was born without arms and with a body so crippled he could neither sit erect nor stand. Yet he excelled in beautiful penmanship while holding the quill in his toes. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you an unusual story about fire worshippers. Through the ages, man has found many ways to pay homage to the gods or god in which he believes. The Parihara or Panda caste of India are literally the most ardent worshippers among India's teeming millions. They adore a deity named Bilat. By dipping a strand of cotton in flaming oil and retaining the burning twist in their mouths until the wick is consumed, they commemorate an ancestral purifying rite undergone in a pit of fire, believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
During the burial service of Captain Joseph G. Belaine in the Church of Gayhead, Massachusetts, a carrier pigeon flew in from the sea and alighted on the bier, as if in tribute to the man who had dedicated his life to save the carrier pigeon from extermination. It stayed until the service was concluded. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the women in everlasting mourning. In the Swiss village of Schulz, the women have been in continuous mourning since the year 1621. During that year, an invading Austrian army massacred 128 men, women, and children in the village. To show their grief, the women survivors of Schulz donned black clothing, and generations of their successors to this day still wear the black clothing, their symbol of eternal mourning. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Romanian peasants believe that a man suffering from rheumatism can recover his full health by having a trained bear walk back and forth on his back for a half hour. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how a tower was named after a monkey. In Rome, Italy, the monkey's tower got its name from a near tragedy. A monkey, imitating a child's nurse, suddenly grabbed an infant belonging to the powerful Frangipani family and climbed with it to the top of this tower. There it dressed and undressed the infant as the mother, frantic with fear, prayed below. Her prayers were answered. The monkey climbed down with the unharmed baby. In commemoration, a light has been burning on the top of the tower for the past 6 centuries. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The Wineglass Tower in Erpenstein, Germany, was built on a rock shaped like a stemmed glass by a man famed for his drinking capacity. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the people who eat underwater. Once a year in India, 5,000 people dine under the surface of a river. The occasion is a 3-day religious festival called Til Sakrant. These pilgrims bathe in a sacred pool in the Sonar River, about 6 miles from the town of Hatta in southern India. The strangest feature of the celebration is the one full meal each one is required to eat in leisurely fashion while holding his head under the water of the Satsuma pool. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
A serving cart was excavated from a mound in Pakatel, Germany, in the investigation of a legend which for 1,000 years had described the mound as once inhabited by dwarfs who were served drinks from a wheeled cart. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the castle that was destroyed by a kiss. The chateau of Villiers-sur-Indre, France, was owned by Philippe de Chauvenay. He stole a kiss from Isabelle de Beaumier. The outraged Isabelle reported the larceny to the King of France, who ordered the castle owned by the kissing bandit demolished as a warning to others. 10 years later, an older and wiser Isabelle returned the kiss to Philippe as a sign of forgiveness. The king then gave his permission to Philippe to rebuild the castle, which is standing to this day. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
There is a bell in the lamasery of Purala in Lhasa, the most sacred sanctuary of Tibet, and it's inscribed with the first words of the Christian hymn, Te Deum Laudamus. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the macabre story of the silent groom. Dorothy Ford was betrothed to the Reverend William Street, rector of the parish of Southpool, England. Her fiancé died a few days before their wedding. At the urging of friends who said they'd been visited by the Reverend Spectre, which complained his soul could not rest while his pledge to marry was unredeemed, the coffin containing the rector's body was brought to the local church. There, in a public marriage ceremony, Dorothy Ford was married to her dead lover, believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The Olympic Theater in Vicenza, Italy, built by Andrea Palladio in 1580, is the first theater in history provided with a roof. All previous theaters were of the open-air variety. It's still in use. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the cruelest practical joke on record. One day, while Mohammed II, Sultan of Turkey, was dining, he was called away before the dessert course. When he returned, a large, juicy watermelon was gone. 14 of the imperial pages were questioned but denied the theft. The Sultan summoned his surgeon and ordered him to open the stomachs of all the pages. There was no trace of watermelon in any of them. The emperor made his half-hearted apologies with a nonchalance that is not to be believed. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Turks who are executed have graves marked by 2 tombstones. The second is a small stone, which is a replica of a turban. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the world's strangest rainfall. The Indian village of Bijori in the district of Mandla in the central provinces of India boasts a precipitation that has no counterpart anywhere on earth. Whenever it rains, beads of all sizes and colors, already bored for stringing, cover the fields in great iridescent profusion. The natives collect them eagerly and prize them highly. They string them for personal adornment into necklaces called Sulamandana, King Solomon's rosaries, and the mystery of their origin has never been cleared up. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The high chair used by King James I of England as an infant, now preserved at Alloa, Scotland, bears a remarkable resemblance to high chairs used today, nearly 400 years later. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the incredible cruelty of a father for the sake of art. The woeful statue of La Dolorosa, the Lady of Sorrows, in the Cathedral of Murcia, Spain, was carved by the celebrated Spanish sculptor Francisco Zarcillo. He used his daughter as a model. In order to trick her into registering the proper amount of grief, the artist handed his daughter a forged letter announcing the suicide of the man she was engaged to marry. The shock nearly broke the young woman's heart. Zarcillo sketched his daughter's sorrow and then explained the trick. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Coco Remu, a Parisian aristocrat who suffered from insomnia, curled up every night for 6 years in a carriage parked in his garden. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the strange way a governor's blindness was cured. In the year 300, St. Sabinus had his hands cut off by order of a Roman governor. This was his punishment for refusing to venerate a pagan god. Years later, the same governor fell victim to a serious eye disease. In a few short weeks, he would have been totally blind. Sabinus heard of his plight and returned kindness for the governor's cruelty. Going to the ruler, he placed the stubs of his arms against the governor's eyes, curing him instantly. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The Church of St. Peter in Montgremoth, England, still has some of the glass panes that were installed in the year 674, the first glass ever manufactured in England. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how an emperor really got into hot water. Because they would not pay homage to the great Emperor Maximilian, two men, St. Crispin and St. Crispinian, the patron saints of cobblers, were ordered to be boiled alive in a huge cauldron of water. His orders were carried out, but after some time in the water, both of the condemned men were still alive, apparently unscathed. This so infuriated the emperor that he jumped into the boiling water to kill the men himself. He was immediately scalded to death. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
In case you didn't know it, cats are more popular than dogs in the United States. There are, according to a survey, 28 million pet cats and only 23 million dogs. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how flies saved a city. In the 4th century, the city of Nisibis was completely surrounded by the Persians. Surrender was near, and the people of the city were doomed. St. James, then the bishop of the besieged city, prayed that God would defeat the Persian army. And then a strange thing happened. Clouds of gnats and flies seemed to appear from nowhere, swarming over the Persian hordes. They threw the Persian army into confusion and retreat. As a result, they lost, and the battle was won by flies. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Jip, a German police dog owned by Herbert Neff of Knoxville, Tennessee, ran away from home, but returned to spend Christmas with the Neffs for 9 successive years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the strong ties of a first love. Elizabeth Alexander of Houghton-le-Scaurne, England, was widowed by Robert Carr in 1718 when she was 18 years old. She survived her first husband for 72 more years, and she was wed twice more, the second time to Philip Bendlows and the third time to Dr. William Alexander. In spite of this, when she died, her body was, at her request, laid beside the mortal remains of her first love, Robert Carr. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The coat of arms of Georgianswald, Germany, shows a forester killing a bear with a club, a feat performed in 1629 by Caspar Kaumann, who saved the life of Duke George Wilhelm and was rewarded with the land on which the town is located. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a 12-year-old paleontologist. The true founder of the modern science of paleontology was a 12-year-old girl named Mary Anning of Lyme Regis, England. In 1811, Mary Anning dug up the first fossilized skeleton of an ichthyosaurus, an extinct reptile that flourished on Earth millions of years ago. Later in her life, she scooped out of the earth the first fossilized skeleton of a plesiosaurus and the first pterodactyl. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
When St. Barbara would not renounce her faith, she was beheaded. Her accuser and executioner was her own father, Dioscorus. The instant he murdered her, he was struck dead by a bolt of lightning. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a bizarre marriage rite. The Lodi caste of the district of Hoshangabad, India, generously allows a bachelor to marry a widow. But before he does, he must undergo a bizarre rite. He must first rid himself of his bachelor status by marrying a pair of earrings. For a whole year, he decorates his ears with this strange wife, after which he may discard his earrings by way of a formal divorce. After that, he's then free to marry the widow. Literally, he gets married by ear, believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The Russians have a word, shirami, which is derived from the French cher ami, or dear friend. In begging for food, French stragglers in the Napoleonic invasion always addressed their host as cher ami. In Russian, it means a tramp. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the animal tax that supported a hospital. No hospital was ever supported as widely or as long as the Royal Hospital of Santiago de Compostela, founded by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1499. For a period of 310 years, every Spanish farmer was obliged to make an annual contribution to the hospital at the rate of 1/3 of a bushel of grain for every pair of oxen, mules, or donkeys he owned. The tax was finally terminated by Napoleon when he invaded Spain in 1809. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the truth. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The doodle tree, Eucalyptus hemistoma of Australia, has insects burrowing beneath the bark, which always gives the tree the appearance of a well-scribbled scratch pad. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the king who died a beggar. Abdallah es Zagal, Moorish king of Granada, sold his kingdom for the equivalent of $17 million. He then crossed over to Africa, where he looked forward to a life of luxury and ease. Instead, he was arrested by Benemerin, king of Fez, who deprived the former king of both his wealth and his eyesight. He was thrust out, blind and destitute, reduced to begging for a living, carrying on his ragged back a parchment reading, "This is the unfortunate king of Andalusia. Believe it or not."
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Today, dueling is against the law. However, did you know that it's forbidden by the Catholic Church because it involves a double sin? The desire to kill and the willingness to die. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about one of the silliest statements ever uttered by a head of government. Baltaji Mohammed Pasha was both Turkish Grand Vizier and Commander-in-Chief of the Turkish armies in 1711, when a powerful Turkish army encircled a Russian army, commanded by Tsar Peter the Great near the River Prut in Moldavia, Romania. No power on earth seemed capable of saving the Russian army. Yet the Turkish commander let his country's mortal enemy escape. Later, when the Grand Vizier was asked why, he said, "If I took the Tsar prisoner, who would rule Russia? Believe it or not."
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Henry VIII had St. John Fisher beheaded. Anne Boleyn asked for the head, and she slapped it rudely. One of the teeth pierced her hand, and the wound never healed. Later, she too was beheaded. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man who was executed because he was strong. In 1692, the Reverend George Burroughs of Wells, Maine, was placed on trial in Salem Village, Massachusetts, charged with witchcraft. The only evidence was the testimony of witnesses who saw the defendant insert a finger in the muzzle of a heavy musket and hold it at arm's length, a feat the court thought was impossible without the aid of sorcery. The defendant pleaded in vain that he'd seen an Indian perform the same feat of strength. He was convicted and hanged. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
There is a place in the world where you'll find women of a few words. An aristocratic woman in the Yoruba tribe in Africa bites on an iron nail day and night so she won't talk too much. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of a weird prophecy in architecture. The architect who built the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Tournai, Belgium in the year 1030 left a prophetic ornament on the structure. One of the pillars inside the church bears a sculptured likeness of the craftsman. Strangely enough, it shows him in the act of tumbling. The statue featured on the pillar was the work of his own hands. A short time after the figure was placed on the pillar, the architect accidentally toppled from a high scaffold and fell or tumbled to his death. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Near Kuprakoy, Turkey, there's a tree that swallowed a water fountain. As it grew, a willow tree engulfed a public fountain with the result that water now spouts from the tree. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man who made $250,000 on a single news item. George Grant, an American immigrant residing in London in 1861, acted with great speed and determination when he read in the London Times that Prince Albert was ailing. He immediately went out and purchased the entire supply of black crepe, which was available in London and its vicinity. When the prince consort died shortly thereafter, Grant, who by then had a corner on the entire available quantity of mourning crepe, disposed of his holdings for a neat profit of more than $250,000. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Thomas Maischberger, an Austrian mountain climber, ascended such peaks as Mont Blanc, Mont Rosa, the Matterhorn, the Jungfrau, and the Meiji. Yet he was handicapped by a wooden leg. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a boy who saw death in the future. William Blake, the mystic poet, artist, and musician, quit his job the first day he was apprenticed to William Rylands, England's foremost engraver. The reason he left Rylands' employ was that whenever the 14-year-old boy looked at his employer, he had the extrasensory vision of Rylands hanging dead on a gallows. The vision became a reality 12 years later, when Rylands was hanged for forgery on August 29, 1783. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
David Lamont, minister of Kirkpatrick, Durham, Scotland for 63 years, married the girl who was the first infant he ever baptized. She was 21 when they were married, and they lived happily together for 38 years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about another unusual love story. John Dixon, a carpenter and joiner of Newberry, South Carolina, was so desperately in love with a young woman that when she turned down his proposal of marriage, he decided to end it all. He made an attempt to commit suicide by hanging. The opportune arrival of a neighbor who severed the rope in the nick of time saved his life. Dixon recovered, but he wrote a novel chapter in the history of happy endings. He found a new love and a willing mate in the person of the girl's mother. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
A silver cup shaped like a fleur-de-lis was bequeathed to the city of Neuchâtel, Switzerland in 1657 by Henri II to commemorate the fact that 40 years before, its citizens had offered him the cup filled with poisoned wine. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the incredible professor. The University of Salamanca, which was founded more than 700 years ago, is the oldest in Spain. Among its lecturers was Christopher Columbus. For 150 years, the chair of mathematics was vacant because of the extraordinarily high standards it demanded from its teachers. The vacancy was finally filled by the appointment of Diego de Torres, whose only qualification for the post was his experience as a highway robber, a dancer, and a bullfighter. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Bakht Singh, ruler of Marwar, India, was killed by his vanity. He couldn't resist trying on a robe sent to him by an enemy. The robe had been dipped in poison, and Bakht died. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the father of 100 crippled daughters. King Kusinava, who ruled over a great Hindu kingdom, was the father of 100 daughters, all of them hunchbacks. To commemorate his great family tragedy, the king founded a city and named it Kanyukajba, the city of the deformed maidens. And there he resided for many years. The capital founded by the tragic king has survived to the present day. It's now the principal city of the district of Farrukhabad, India, its name having been reduced to the modern Kanyuaj. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
A chasm 130 feet deep was carved from solid rock in the 12th century to bar access to the castle of Sayun in Syria. A tower of stone was left in the center of the chasm to support a drawbridge. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the tale of a shoemaker who became a king. In Algiers in North Africa, the ruler in 1695 was a renowned warrior named Shaban. He was deposed by a group of rebels. Needing a new ruler, they noticed an ancient cobbler mending the local babouches, or slippers. His name was Haj Ahmed. They snatched the frightened old man and had him formally enthroned. He ruled Algeria for 3 years until he died in an epidemic in July 1698. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
The Church of St. Nicholas in Blois, France, was built in the village of Foy, whose inhabitants had been slaves from birth. They were freed forever as a reward for constructing the church. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of the Golden Galley. When Napoleon was a little boy, he was fascinated by the book, A History of Venice. Years passed, and then one day in 1798, the fate of Venice lay in Napoleon's hands. He inquired for the Golden Galley, the ornate state barge from which the espousal of the sea took place for many centuries. Burn it, he decreed. As the flames began to lick the Golden Galley, a stream of molten gold flowed from the pyre. The galley had been truly named. It yielded $500,000 worth of pure gold. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Dante, Italy's greatest poet, now lies in a tomb in Ravenna, illuminated by an oil lamp lit since September 1908. Dante's hometown, Florence, has undertaken to keep the lamp burning for all eternity. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a mad monarch's revenge. Abdul Hassan Ali, who at the age of 16 became the Caliph of Egypt, invited 2,660 of the most beautiful young ladies of Cairo to a sumptuous feast. As soon as the building was filled, a company of masons was ordered to seal up all exits with brick and mortar. 6 months later, the mad ruler ordered the doors opened and had the young captive skeletons removed for burial. The revenge was for a slight offered him by the Egyptian capital. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Baron Oscar von Redwitz, was the strangest hypochondriac in history. During the last 28 years of his life, he complained of and described more than 10,000 ailments, each of them unknown to medical science, believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the colonel who killed himself for his regiment. Lord Charles Greville Montague, colonel of the Cumberland Regiment, landed with his men in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in the dead of a very harsh winter. The men complained, and the colonel promised to forward their grievance to the commanding general in Quebec, 600 miles away, a 3-month round trip on snowshoes. The colonel made the round trip in 6 weeks. The physical strain was too much, and he died 4 days after his return. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
John Breckenridge, a noted singer and poet of Tollcross, Scotland, fought anybody who ever sang his compositions in public. And shortly before he died, he cast into the flames all his works, poems, songs, and epigrams. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how a hot bath made a man a king. After Emperor Constans II was assassinated in his bath in Syracuse, Sicily, his assassins looked for a successor to the throne of Byzantium. Their choice was General Massisi, who flatly refused to ascend the throne. To coerce him, the army commander simply tossed him, fully clothed and armored, into the same hot bath in which Constans had perished. The discomfort of the hot bath helped the reluctant Massisi to change his mind, and he accepted the crown. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
On November 26, 1703, the great Eddystone Lighthouse off Plymouth, England, was demolished by a storm. Henry Whistonleigh, the builder, died in the disaster. At the same time, in Whistonleigh's home, 200 miles away, a replica of the lighthouse fell from a shelf and was smashed. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a castle owned by the devil. The last earthly owner of the Chateau of Tiffauges in France was Gilles de Rais, who's identified as the original Bluebeard. He is said to have murdered 140 young boys. Gilles conveyed to the devil title to all his property. There's a deed still in existence, vesting in the devil the ownership of the castle, thus making Satan the legal owner of this bit of French real estate. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Laborers in China who use huge wheelbarrows to transport freight avoid extra wear on their vehicles by taking them apart at the end of each working day and carrying the parts home on their backs. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the strangest library in all history. Sahib Ibn Abbad, the scholarly Grand Vizier of Persia, was a fervent reader and had a library of 117,000 volumes. Since he was obliged to travel widely, he carried the library around with him on the backs of 400 camels. The beasts of burden of this huge portable collection were specially trained to travel in alphabetical order and were attended by a host of camel driver librarians who could locate any book their master desired in the shortest time. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Great Tom, the huge bell of Christ Church in Oxford, England, has been rung exactly 101 times every evening since 1284 in commemoration of the 101 students of the first Oxford class. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about some very unusual food handlers. The food handlers employed by the Maharaja of Udaipur, India, are always members of the Jain sect, who consider all forms of life so sacred that they wear face masks. These food carriers are the most practical solution for the hygienic handling of the Maharaja's food. They perpetually cover their mouths to avoid inhaling small gnats or other flying insects. They do this lest they inadvertently harm an insect by inhaling it. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The Russian word sorok, meaning 40, also means a shirt. In old Russia, 40 animal skins were always carried wrapped in a shirt. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll have some more words for you as well as their interesting meanings. A flock of ships is called a fleet. A fleet of sheep is called a flock. A flock of girls is called a bevy. A bevy of wolves is called a pack. A pack of thieves is called a gang. A gang of angels is called a host. A host of porpoises is called a shoal. A shoal of buffaloes is called a troop. A troop of partridges is called a covey. A covey of beauties is called a galaxy. A galaxy of ruffians is called a horde. A horde of gangsters is called a mob. A mob of whales is called a school. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
An empty gallon can will hold 1 gallon of ammonia gas. Yet when the same can is filled with water, it will increase its capacity to 600 gallons of ammonia gas. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how a stroke of lightning made a church. A stroke of lightning is responsible for the church of San Marcos in Salamanca, Spain. The shell of the building was originally a tower of the city walls. In the 14th century, lightning struck the tower and converted the spire into a side view likeness of a human face. The natives declared that the miraculous profile was that of King Alfonso XI, then reigning. He acknowledged the resemblance and felt impelled to convert the tower into a church. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Lincoln's Inn Fields, a 12-acre square, is the largest in London. It was designed in 1618 by the celebrated architect Inigo Jones to conform to the exact size and shape of the base of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a woman worth her weight in gold. Warren Hastings, the great empire builder and first Governor-General of British India, fell in love with the Baroness Anna Maria Imhoff. Before her husband would grant her a divorce, Hastings turned over to him a quantity of gold equal to her weight. It took 8 years before they could be legally married. By that time, Madame Imhoff was nearly 40 years old, and during 41 years of married life, he never wavered in his love for the woman he priced above gold. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The Hill of the Bells in Hermosillo, Mexico, produces music ranging from the sound of an organ to the melody of a flute. It's caused by air currents escaping from a cave within the mountain. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the most seductive murderess in the annals of justice. Madame Henriette Ollier of Brussels, Belgium, was tried on a charge of having poisoned her husband, her parents, and her 2 sisters. The tribunal consisted of 5 married judges who unanimously declared the defendant not guilty. The judges' deliberation was prolonged by an argument among them as to who was entitled to marry her. Judge Verneuil won. They might have lived happily ever after, but for the return of her accomplice and ex-lover. He confessed. The case was reopened. They were both found guilty and hanged. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The sacred peepal tree of Burma is believed to be inhabited by spirits. Small houses are built beside each tree to make the spirits more comfortable. Pilgrims donate rent money lest the spirits be evicted. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a king who died of double trouble. King Yasalalakatisa, who ruled the kingdom of Ceylon for 7 years, was overjoyed when he discovered that he had a double. The king appointed him doorman of his palace. Whenever the king was in a merry mood, he would swap clothes and places with the doorman. He could then laugh at his courtiers and ministers of state, offering homage to the false king. Then, one day, during the next masquerade, the double decided to take advantage of his temporary authority. He ordered the real king seized and executed on the spot. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Tansen, the most famous singer in India's history, for a single concert at the court of Emperor Akbar the Great, was paid the fantastic fee of $3,245,000. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the story of the indestructible pilgrim. The chamberlain of King Philip I of France offered to substitute for his master when the king was unable to fulfill a vow to travel to the tomb of Christ in Jerusalem. The substitute made the pilgrimage on foot, except while crossing the sea, never removed his armor, both coming and going, and carried a lighted candle all the way. The round trip took a year, and the grateful king rewarded the iron-constituted pilgrim and his descendants with eternal freedom from taxes. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Hugh Barron was appointed hereditary janitor of Skipton Castle in England. He bequeathed his post to 12 successive generations, and they held the job for 438 years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the best-dressed women in the world. It's for sure the American woman would not consider the women of the Zadrina district of Albania the best-dressed women in the world. Perhaps the most dressed, for this is what they wear in summer as well as winter. Their attire includes a heavy linen shirt, linen trousers, heavy wool stockings, gold-embroidered shoes, a wool skirt, 2 embroidered vests, an apron, scarves, silk kerchiefs, and a heavy head shawl worn over 2 bonnets. It all adds up to 100 pounds of clothing. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Cardinal George d'Ambrosio, Prime Minister to King Louis XII of France, inspired the phrase, "Let George do it," 460 years ago. King Louis was lazy, and that was his reply to every request. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the woman who was killed by a prophecy. Sophia, Lady Beresford, who was born on February 23rd, 1666, had a dream that she would die on her 47th birthday. Lady Beresford was quite concerned, at least until she thought she had safely passed that birthday. Once that birthday was over, she breathed easier. Then she learned she had consulted the Georgian calendar instead of the Julian calendar. As a result, she died of shock on February 23rd, 1713, on her 47th birthday. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
John Swain of Shapewick, England, faced execution, but he escaped from a squad of soldiers by 2 consecutive leaps that were later measured and found to have spanned 40 feet 11 inches. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man who towed a whale with one hand. Donald Macaulay was out setting lobster pots with his 5 brothers when they discovered a dead whale off Lewis Island in the Hebrides. He was warned by officials that it would be Crown property if it washed ashore. Not wanting to lose their prize to the Crown, Donald Macaulay came up with what seemed like an impossible solution. He cut a hole in the whale's tail big enough to insert his hand, and with the help of his brothers pulling at the oars of their boat, towed the monster out to sea. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe it or not.
Tostin Cleven was declared dead of the Black Plague on the ship Amelia in 1840. He was saved from being buried at sea only because friends won permission to bury him in New York. He revived in an undertaking establishment and lived for another 58 years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a Victory Castle. A castle in Corsica originally was part of Napoleon's palace of the Tuileries in Paris. This is the castle which was burned by a French mob in 1871. After that fire, Duke Jerome Pozzo de Borgo, whose family had long feuded with that of Napoleon in Corsica, bought the debris and then spent $400,000 and 15 years rebuilding the castle. He did it simply to display a symbol of his victory over his old enemy. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
E. Cook, Oklahoma University halfback, swam to a touchdown. A blocked kick fell into a river behind the goalposts, and Cook swam the ball back for a touchdown. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man whose waistline measured more than his height. Those of you who've been fighting the battle of the bulging waistline can appreciate the problem that Wouter Van Twiller must have had. Wouter was the second governor of New Netherlands from 1633 to 1638. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall and 6 feet 5 inches in circumference, making his waistline measure more than his height. Van Twiller was recalled to Holland on the complaint of residents of New Netherlands that he spent 16 hours each day just eating and sleeping. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
The standard measuring device by which all ancient fluid measures of the Roman Empire were verified has been standing in the marketplace of Pompeii, Italy for more than 2,000 years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the deadly gateposts. No one will ever really know whether it was just a weird coincidence or actually a prophecy coming true. But for centuries, the two gateposts of Margam in Wales were left standing because of a prophecy that if they were destroyed, the noble Mansell family would vanish with them. However, in 1744, the full impact of this frightening prediction came true when young Lord Thomas Mansell pulled down the pillars. Within the year, the family was wiped out by his death and that of both of his brothers. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
The women snake charmers of Pakistan never use musical instruments to charm the reptiles. They employ only the voice. The reason for this is that a serpent's whispered advice led to Eve's downfall in the Garden of Eden. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the Bridge of Death. One of the weirdest bridges in the world is the Bridge of Death, which is an arch over the river Ludius near Klidi, Greece. It is 59 feet long and 23 feet high, and is all that remains of an ancient Roman bridge that was looted of all its other stones by the local farmers. The looting continued until they came to the realization that all of those who had carried away the stones from the bridge had died within the year. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Married men in the Akela tribe in Africa always cut their meat into small chunks with a knife held between their toes because before their wedding, they were required to knock out all their own teeth. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man who bit a crocodile. There have been many stories told about an instance when a man bites a dog. However, I don't think you'll hear many about a man who bites a crocodile. When this man named Hannock was seized by a huge crocodile while swimming in the Kafu River in northern Rhodesia, he decided to bite back. He clamped his teeth on the tip of the reptile's tail, forcing the crocodile to release him and retreat into deep water. Although Hannock himself had been severely bitten, he recovered in the hospital at Lusaka. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
A bride in the Matakam tribe in Africa always wears half a pumpkin dyed red as a hat. Then, when she has a baby, the pumpkin is reversed on her head to serve as the infant's cradle. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the Well of Death. The Well of Death, located in the prison of the Seven Towers in Istanbul, was aptly named. It has a long and sorrowful history. Literally thousands of state prisoners who were beheaded by the order of reigning sultans found no final resting place here. After death, their bodies were dropped into the well, which, because of its unusual location, was bottomless. Once dropped into the well, the bodies were always washed out to sea. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Vijaya of Singapore, to celebrate each birthday, hangs another lemon, the symbol of the Hindu god Subramanya, on hooks embedded in his skin. Yet the wounds never bleed. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a colonel's strange wound. Colonel James Gardiner of Scotland received a strange wound in the Battle of Ramillies on May 23rd, 1706. While shouting commands, he had a bullet pass through his open mouth without injuring his teeth, his tongue, gums, or palate. In fact, it virtually did no damage at all. The slug passed out the back of his neck, leaving a hole that remained open until he died. The colonel died of other wounds in the Battle of Prestopans 39 years later. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
The first 21-gun salute to the American flag was fired in 1776 by Johannes de Graaf, governor of the West Indies. Whereupon he was promptly dismissed for such an unlawful act. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the most unusual home run exhibition ever seen. Do you know the greatest number of home runs ever hit by a professional baseball player in 1 hour? The man who set the record was Babe Ruth at Wrigley Field, Chicago in 1927. Babe stood at the plate for an hour while various pitchers tossed him balls to hit over the fence. When the hour was up, the amazed crowd had watched the greatest home run exhibition of all time. The total home runs hit was 125. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Judge Henry Jodrell of the Criminal Court of Great Yarmouth, England, after serving 21 years on the bench, resigned to avoid having to pronounce his first death sentence. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the corpse that stopped a mutiny. Many times, superstition and fear changes the course of events in history. When the citizens of Toulouse rebelled against King Henry III of France, they murdered Jean Durante, Speaker of the local parliament, and as an act of contempt, propped up his corpse in front of a portrait of the king he loved and served. Suddenly, a strange thing happened. Durante's body slipped down to his knees in a position of reverence. The rebels, upon witnessing this, were so unnerved that they abandoned their mutiny. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
The masks which were worn by ancient Roman actors were not only for the audience's eyes, they were also for its ears. They served as voice amplifiers so the actors could be heard throughout the vast Roman theaters. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the prophet who could not change his own fate. Fadl ben Shahar was Grand Vizier of Caliph Mamun in Baghdad, and he was also a famed clairvoyant. He even predicted his own death at the hands of Ali Arida in his bath. In an attempt to change his fate, he tried to make friends with his foe. He even persuaded the Caliph Mamun to name Ali Arida as his successor. But his scheme backfired, for when Ali took over, his first official act was to have Fadl assassinated, and it was in his bath, believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Thomas Jefferson Chambers of Anahuac, Texas, was killed by an assassin. The bullet passed through the victim's chest and lodged in the identical spot in a portrait of Chambers hanging on the wall. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man who married his own wife and didn't know it. Talk about a man not knowing his wife. Henry Canaston, an English outlaw, divorced a noblewoman named Isabel of Ashton after 10 years of marriage. Then, 15 years later, he was married again to a woman named Marion of Oswestry. It was not until he was on his deathbed 13 years later that he learned both Isabel, his first wife, and Marion, the woman to whom he was married, was the same woman. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
If you think you spend a lot of time at your hairdresser's, consider a Longo chief in Tanganyika, East Africa. His badge of office is a hairdo that requires 5 years to complete. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the woman who saw her husband die twice. Julia Gardner Tyler, wife of former President John Tyler, in a dream on the night of January 16, 1862, saw her husband walking toward her with his collar and tie in his hands as he cried out, "I'm dying, Julia." The dream prompted her to hurry to her husband, who was in Richmond, Virginia. She found him in perfect health. But the very next morning, Tyler came to his wife's room with his collar and tie in his hands and cried out, "I'm dying, Julia." He died shortly after midnight. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Aunt Rika made a shroud for every person who died in a German community for a period of 41 years and always appeared at the doomed one's home 72 hours before a death. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you the strangest crime detection in all history. The story of Jonas Rushford would challenge the imagination of some of our greatest super sleuths. When Jonas was a boy of 12 in Bromley, England, he was hypnotized by Timothy Crowther. While under the hypnotic spell, he solved the mystery of the disappearance of John Simpson of Bramley by looking into a mirror. Jonas said he saw 2 thugs kill Simpson and conceal his body in an abandoned coal mine. The police found the victim and captured the killers. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Peter Paul Rubens, the famous Flemish painter, was knighted by King Charles I of England because he could not pay Rubens his $15,000 fee for painting a ceiling. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the strangest treasure hunt in all history. John Chapman made a trip to London because he had dreamed that the trip would bring him a buried treasure. On the way, he stopped to ask a stranger for directions. When he confided his dream, the stranger scoffed at his story, remarking, "If I believed in dreams, I'd be on my way to Swaffham because I dreamed there's a treasure buried there in the garden of a man named Chapman." Upon hearing this, Chapman hurried home and found 2 treasure crocks buried there, right in his own garden. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. This is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
In the year 1669, the entire village of Brunswick, England, slipped into the sea. Yet not a single inhabitant was drowned. All the residents were attending a funeral in a neighboring village at the time. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the foundling who floated ashore. Many strange tales are told of the sea, but one of the most unusual is the foundling who floated ashore from a foundered ship. The infant was discovered in a box on a crude raft as it was washed onto the beach at Provincetown, Massachusetts. He was the only survivor of a ship that sank in a storm. The child was adopted and given the name George Soper. He never learned his true name, the nationality of his parents, or even the name of the ship. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Jane Garron of Rothwell, England, was warned in childhood she would die on her birthday. So she spent each anniversary of her birth in bed, where she died on her 100th birthday. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the War Council that was ruled by an empty chair. General Eumenes, secretary to Alexander the Great, dominated the other generals after Alexander's death by convincing them that the monarch had appeared in a dream and ordered the council to hold all future meetings in the presence of Alexander's throne, crown, and scepter. Eumenes was obeyed as spokesman for the royal ghost until he himself was slain. The War Council was ruled for 8 years by an empty chair. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Cornelius White of Pembroke, Massachusetts, was the perfect host. During one of his parties, he rode on horseback to Boston and back, 75 miles in 6 hours, to buy a bag of lemons for punch. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man who officiated at his own wedding. Richard Bellingham was governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. In the year 1641, he married Penelope Pelham. The thing which made the ceremony more than a little unusual was that he performed the marriage ceremony himself. Naturally, his act was a violation of the law. However, he could not be brought to trial. The reason for this was he was also Chief Justice of the community and would preside over his own trial. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
If all the diamonds in the world, mined from the beginning of the industry, could be fused into a single gem, they would form only a 7 1/2 foot cube. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a temple that's a huge lollipop. The sanctuary of Katra Madriganj in the state of Pratapgarh, Rajputan, India, was erected over a gushing spring. The water is so richly saturated with sugar that it's possible to distill thick molasses from it by boiling. The saccharine spring overflows at regular intervals and drenches the temple with a sugary flood. As a result, the edifice is always thickly encrusted with sugar, and the walls of the temple are eagerly licked by sweet, starved children. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Bradgate House in England was burned by Anne Grey in an unsuccessful attempt to force her husband to move back to London. It has been preserved as a ruin for 268 years as an object lesson to all wives. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man who tempted fate. The hand of fate is a fickle one. It can be kind to some and extremely cruel to others. And if Thomas Rogers was at all superstitious, he certainly would not have tempted fate by staying in the mining business. Rogers was a lead miner of Yarnbury, England. On December 16th, 1852, he was killed by a rock fall. It was the same type of accident in the same mine that had taken the lives of his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
The St. James Gate Brewery in Dublin, Ireland was leased by a merchant in 1759 for 9,000 years. His successors are still operating it with more than 8,700 years to go. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the House of Unhappy Marriages. The subject of husbands and wives quarreling has long been a topic for stories and jokes, particularly when the little woman decides she's had it and goes home to mother to seek understanding. However, in Assam, India, the situation is a little different. They have a House of Unhappy Marriages. It's a hut constructed 40 feet in the air in which the quarreling couples must live together for a full week without even seeing their in-laws. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
The hairdo of a Zulu bride is literally a honeymoon coiffure. It's plastered with honey, and she's forbidden to undo it for 6 months. When she lets her hair down, the honeymoon is over. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the scorn of a very angry woman. One of the best examples of deep scorn by a woman was exhibited by Giles, Countess of Donoil, Ireland. After seeing her husband hanged by Cromwell's troops, she was told she could retain her possessions only by marrying one of the English officers. To show her contempt for all of them, she walked along a line of officers whose backs were turned to her. She then selected one of the officers without even seeing his face. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
Captain Henry Stout, wounded by Comanche Indians near the Trinity River in Texas, rode with an iron-tipped arrow in his thigh to Fort Towson, a distance of 180 miles. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the most elaborate funeral in all history. The peoples of the earth have found many ways to pay a last tribute to their honored heroes when they die. But probably the most elaborate funeral in all history was when the body of Alexander the Great was carried from Babylon to Alexandria in a jewel-studded hearse, drawn by 64 horses over a road hacked through a wilderness for a distance of 1,000 miles. The funeral cost a total of $600 million. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
A silver tea strainer in the Delaware Historical Society Museum was hammered from the first silver dollar that was earned by Benjamin Franklin. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the woman who was so jaded that she invited herself to her husband's execution. The wife of the 11th Earl of Shrewsbury was one of the most faithless women in history. She ran away with the Duke of Buckingham, so the Earl challenged his rival to a duel. The wronged Earl died of wounds inflicted by the Duke in the fight, unaware that his faithless wife had been so eager to witness his death that she dressed in the costume of a page boy and held the Duke's horse while he killed her husband. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's. Believe it or not.
The goblet used by the Sultan of Fumban in Equatorial Africa was made from a gruesome substance indeed. For some strange reason, he had it made from the skull of his bitterest enemy. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man who believed it was never too late to learn. Bishop Richard Cumberland of Peterborough, England, learned a new language in the year 1716 when he was 85 years old. The printer had given him an advance copy of the New Testament, which was translated into Coptic, a late form of ancient Egyptian. In order to read the new edition, Bishop Cumberland mastered Coptic within a year. He never regretted this great mental effort, although he died 2 years after his crowning achievement. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Edward, Prince of Wales, the Black Prince, captured King John of France in the Battle of Poitiers and entertained him and his aides at supper, personally serving the entire meal to his prisoners. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the man who turned down a gold mine. The moral to the story of Albert Eugene Carlton of Cripple Creek, Colorado, is that a man should never give up hope, no matter how dark his future looks. When Carlton was 25 years of age, he was offered the Independence Gold Mine for $500. He refused to buy the mine because he thought he had only 6 months to live. Carlton lived to be 65, and the gold mine was sold to a British syndicate for $11 million. Believe it or not.
That was the final part of Ripley's Believe It or Not. We will have more different shows for next week. Airchecks is a 3-hour podcast uploaded every Saturday and can be heard on the K-Tai radio network every Sunday. See you on the same time and same channel.